Hello everyone. Tonight I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, close your eyes and let's begin. Story 1. The Missing Children's Gallery. The highway stretched endlessly before Marcus as he guided his 18-wheeler through the amber glow of another sunset. He had been driving for nearly 15 years, and the familiar rhythm of the road had become his meditation, his escape from the complexities of life back home. The CB radio crackled softly with distant conversations between other drivers, creating a comforting backdrop to his solitary journey. It was on a Tuesday evening in October when Marcus first noticed something peculiar about the truck stops along his route. As he pulled into a rest area outside of Bakersfield, his eyes were drawn to the bulletin board near the entrance. Missing children posters covered every available inch of space, their innocent faces staring out from beneath bold letters that read, "Have you seen me?" The usual collection of flyers and advertisements had been completely obscured by these desperate pleas from families searching for their lost ones. Marcus studied the board with a heavy heart, as any parent would. He recognized some of the faces from his travels over the years, children who had vanished from small towns along his regular routes. There was little Emma Rodriguez, who had disappeared from a playground in New Mexico 3 years ago. Timothy Chen, last seen walking home from school in Nevada. Sarah Williams, who had gone missing from a camping trip in Arizona. Their faces seemed to follow him as he walked toward the diner, their eyes filled with an otherworldly sadness that made his chest tighten with unexplained grief. Inside the truck stop, Marcus ordered his usual coffee and sandwich, trying to shake off the melancholy that had settled over him like a heavy blanket. The waitress, a kind woman named Betty who had served him many times before, noticed his troubled expression. She leaned across the counter and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, as if sharing a sacred secret. "Those children's faces been appearing everywhere lately," she said, her eyes darting toward the bulletin board outside. "Drivers been talking about it on their routes. Same faces showing up at truck stops, hundreds of miles apart, sometimes on the same day. Makes you wonder if someone's trying to tell us something." As Marcus returned to his truck that evening, he found himself unable to stop thinking about Betty's words. He settled into a sleeper cabin and tried to rest, but sleep eluded him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces from the bulletin board, their expressions seeming to shift from sadness to something more urgent, more desperate. It was as if they were trying to communicate something important, something that his conscious mind couldn't quite grasp. The next morning brought another truck stop and another bulletin board filled with missing children's faces. This time, Marcus counted them carefully. 47 children, ranging in age from 5 to 16, all missing from towns along his regular driving routes. What struck him most was the pattern he began to notice in their disappearances. Each child had vanished from locations that were easily accessible from major highways, places where a large truck could come and go without attracting attention. As he continued his journey, Marcus found himself becoming obsessed with documenting these faces. He began taking photographs of each bulletin board he encountered, comparing them to create a comprehensive map of the missing children along his route. The pattern became clearer with each stop. The disappearances formed a trail that followed the exact highways he had been traveling for over a decade, as if someone had been using his route as a hunting ground. The haunting began subtly at first. Marcus would catch glimpses of children in his peripheral vision standing by the roadside or walking along the shoulder of the highway. When he turned to look directly, there would be nothing there but empty landscape stretching toward the horizon. He attributed these sightings to fatigue and the stress of his discovery, but deep down, he knew something more profound was happening. One night, while parked at a rest area in Colorado, Marcus was awakened by the sound of small hands tapping against his truck's exterior walls. The rhythm was gentle but persistent, like raindrops against a window during a summer storm. He peered out through the curtains of his sleeper cabin but saw nothing in the parking lot except other trucks and the soft glow of security lights casting long shadows across the asphalt. The tapping continued for several minutes before gradually fading away, leaving Marcus with a profound sense of longing and loss that he couldn't explain. He found himself wondering if the children were trying to guide him towards some truth, some revelation that could bring peace to their families and justice for their disappearances. As the weeks passed, Marcus began to notice changes in his own behavior and perception. He found himself taking different routes, following impulses that seemed to come from outside his conscious decision-making. These detours led him to discover additional bulletin boards, more faces, and gradually a clearer picture of what might have happened to these lost souls. The children seemed to be leading him on a journey of discovery, using their presence to guide him toward locations where evidence might still remain. Old truck stops that had been abandoned, remote rest areas where few drivers ventured, and forgotten stretches of highway that had been bypassed by newer construction. At each location, Marcus felt their presence more strongly, as if they were grateful for his attention and determination to uncover the truth. One evening, while examining yet another collection of missing children's posters, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. Among the familiar faces was a photograph he recognized from his own past. A little girl named Angela Morrison, who had disappeared 15 years ago from a truck stop where Marcus had made a delivery on his very first week as a professional driver. He remembered the commotion, the police cars, and the frantic search that had consumed the entire area for days. The realization hit him like a physical blow. These children weren't just showing him a pattern of disappearances. They were showing him his own unwitting connection to their tragedies. For 15 years, Marcus had been traveling the same routes, stopping at the same locations, following the same schedule as someone who had been hunting these innocent victims. The children had been trying to tell him that he wasn't just a witness to their disappearances, he was somehow connected to them in ways he was only beginning to understand. Marcus spent the next several days in a state of profound contemplation, driving his routes with new awareness and purpose. The children's faces seemed less haunting now and more like guides, leading him toward a truth that needed to be revealed. He began to document not just the missing children's information, but also his own travel logs, delivery schedules, and the locations where he had stopped during his 15 years on the road. The pattern that emerged was both terrifying and illuminating. Every single missing child had disappeared from a location that Marcus had visited within 48 hours of their vanishing. The correlation was too precise to be coincidental, yet Marcus knew with absolute certainty that he had never harmed anyone. The children seemed to know this too, for their presence around him felt protective rather than accusatory. Late one night, while parked at the same Colorado rest area where he had first heard the tapping sounds, Marcus experienced the most profound encounter of his journey. As he lay in his sleeper cabin, he heard the gentle sound of a child's voice calling his name. The voice was clear and unmistakable, filled with trust and hope rather than fear or anger. "Marcus," the voice said softly, "we need you to find him. He's still out there, still hunting. You're the only one who knows the pattern, the only one who can stop him before he takes more of us." In that moment, Marcus understood his purpose with crystal clarity. The missing children hadn't been haunting him, they had been recruiting him. Their spirits had recognized something in him, a combination of knowledge, access, and moral integrity that made him uniquely qualified to bring their killer to justice. They had chosen him as their champion, their voice in a world that had failed to protect them. Marcus spent the remainder of that night compiling all of his documentation into a comprehensive report. He included photographs of every bulletin board, maps showing the correlation between his routes and the disappearances, and detailed timelines that revealed the pattern with undeniable clarity. When dawn broke over the mountains, he knew what he had to do. The next morning, Marcus drove to the nearest FBI field office and presented his findings to a special agent who specialized in cases involving missing children. The agent listened with growing interest and alarm as Marcus explained his discovery and the supernatural guidance that had led him to the truth. While the agent remained skeptical about the spiritual aspects of Marcus's story, the evidence he presented was compelling enough to warrant a full investigation. Within weeks, the FBI had identified a suspect, another truck driver who had been following Marcus's exact routes with suspicious precision. The man had been using Marcus's delivery schedule, which was publicly available through the trucking company's dispatch system, to plan his hunting expeditions. He knew that if a child disappeared shortly after Marcus had passed through an area, any investigation would likely focus on the more obvious suspect. The arrest brought closure to dozens of families and prevented countless future tragedies. Marcus continued driving his routes, but now the bulletin board showed fewer fresh faces and more success stories of children who had been found and returned safely to their families. The spirits of the missing children gradually faded from his experience, their mission completed and their rest finally earned. On quiet evenings, when the highway stretched empty before him and the stars shone brightly overhead, Marcus still sometimes felt their presence. But now it was peaceful and grateful, a gentle reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, justice and truth have a way of finding their champion. The road had taught him that some journeys are about more than reaching a destination. They're about answering a calling that comes from beyond the visible world, from souls who refuse to be forgotten until their truth is finally told. Story 2, The Whispering Voices. The first time Carl Morrison heard the voice telling him to turn the wheel hard to the right and drive into oncoming traffic, he assumed it was just fatigue playing tricks on his mind. He had been driving for 16 hours straight, pushing through a delivery deadline that his dispatcher had assured him was critical for maintaining their contract. The voice was soft and persuasive, almost hypnotic in its gentle insistence that steering into the median would bring him the peace he had been seeking for so many years. Carl shook his head vigorously and reached for his thermos of coffee, the bitter liquid providing a sharp contrast to the sweet, seductive quality of the voice that continued to whisper in his ear. He rolled down the windows of his cab, letting the cool night air rush through the interior and hoping that the change in atmosphere would clear whatever cobwebs had settled in his mind. The voice faded gradually, leaving behind only the familiar sounds of his diesel engine and the rhythmic hum of tires against asphalt. He had been driving professionally for over 20 years, and Carl prided himself on his safety record. Not a single accident, not even a minor fender bender or a citation for speeding. His dedication to safe driving practices had earned him recognition from his company and respect from his fellow drivers. The idea that his own mind would betray him with thoughts of deliberately causing harm was so foreign to his nature that he dismissed the experience as nothing more than an isolated incident brought on by exhaustion. But the voices returned the following week, during another long haul across the desert highways of Nevada. This time, there were multiple voices, a chorus of different tones and ages, all unified in their gentle encouragement for Carl to make small adjustments to his steering that would result in catastrophic consequence. They spoke with the voices of his deceased mother, his high school sweetheart, and even his own voice from years past, creating a symphony of familiar comfort that made their deadly suggestions seem almost reasonable. "Just a little to the left, Carl," his mother's voice whispered with the same loving tone she had used to guide him through childhood fears. "It's time to come home, sweetheart. No more lonely roads, no more empty truck stops, no more sleeping in parking lots while the world moves on without you." The voice of his high school sweetheart, Sarah, joined the chorus with words that tugged at his heart. "Remember how happy we were before you chose the road over our future together? You could have that happiness again, Carl. All you have to do is stop fighting so hard to stay in this world that never really wanted you anyway. Carl found himself gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white, his body trembling with the effort required to resist the increasingly persuasive arguments being presented by these familiar voices. He began talking back to them, engaging in conversations that would have appeared to be the ravings of a madman to any observer, but which felt like the most important negotiations of his life. "I'm not ready to give up," he said aloud, his voice echoing in the cab. "There are still places I haven't seen, still deliveries to make, still people depending on me to get their goods where they need to be. I may be lonely sometimes, but that doesn't mean my life doesn't have value." The voices responded with patience and understanding, never becoming angry or demanding, but simply continuing their gentle persistence. They painted pictures of reunion with lost loved ones, of rest from the constant pressure and responsibility, of escape from the aching loneliness that had become his constant companion during long nights on the road, so compelling and so lovingly presented that Carl began to understand how someone could be convinced to surrender to their suggestions. As the weeks passed, Carl developed a complex relationship with these voices. During daylight hours, when traffic was heavy and his mind was occupied with the practical concerns of navigation and delivery schedules, the voices remained largely silent, but as evening approached and the highways emptied, they would begin their whispered campaign, growing stronger and more insistent as the night deepened. Carl began to research the phenomenon, spending his downtime in truck stop parking lots reading about auditory hallucinations, sleep deprivation psychosis, and the psychological effects of long-term isolation. He learned that many long-haul drivers experienced similar episodes, though few were willing to discuss them openly for fear of losing their commercial driving licenses. The knowledge that he wasn't alone in his experience brought some comfort, but it didn't diminish the growing power that the voices seemed to hold over his thoughts and emotions. During one particularly difficult night in Montana, the voices changed their approach entirely. Instead of encouraging him to harm himself, they began suggesting that he use his truck as a weapon against other drivers who had wronged him over the years. They reminded him of every slight, every discourtesy, every moment of disrespect he had endured from other motorists, building a case for righteous vengeance that was as seductive as it was terrifying. "That sedan that cut you off in Denver last month," his own voice whispered with cold logic. The driver never even looked back, never acknowledged the danger he created. He's probably still out there, still endangering other drivers, still believing that his time is more valuable than everyone else's safety. You could teach him a lesson, Carl. You could make sure he never endangers another trucker again. The suggestion filled Carl with a rage that seemed to come from outside his own emotions, a fury that felt foreign and imposed rather than genuinely felt. He recognized this as perhaps the most dangerous development yet in his ongoing battle with these mysterious voices. They had moved beyond simple self-destructive suggestions to actively trying to turn him into a threat to others, transforming his natural protective instincts into weapons of aggression. Carl made the difficult decision to seek professional help, despite the potential consequences for his career. He scheduled an appointment with a psychiatrist who specialized in occupational mental health, driving several hundred miles out of his way to reach the doctor's office in a city where he was unlikely to encounter anyone from his professional circle. The session was both illuminating and disturbing as the doctor explained the various factors that could contribute to command hallucinations in long-haul drivers. Chronic sleep deprivation, social isolation, irregular eating patterns, and the constant stress of deadline pressure create a perfect storm for psychological breakdown, the doctor explained in a calm, clinical tone. Your brain is essentially creating companions to ease the loneliness, but these companions are manifestations of your own suppressed anxieties and fears. They represent your mind's attempt to find an escape from circumstances that have become unbearable. The doctor prescribed medication to help regulate Carl's sleep patterns and reduce the frequency of hallucinations, but he also recommended significant changes to Carl's lifestyle and work habits: more frequent breaks, better nutrition, regular exercise, and most importantly, finding ways to maintain meaningful human connections despite the isolating nature of his profession. Carl implemented these changes gradually, but the voices didn't disappear immediately. Instead, they seemed to adapt to his new routines, finding ways to work around the medication and the improved self-care practices. They became more subtle in their approach, weaving their suggestions into seemingly innocent observations about traffic conditions or road hazards. A comment about black ice on a bridge would be accompanied by a whispered suggestion that losing control might not be entirely accidental. An observation about construction zones would include gentle encouragement to ignore the warning signs and maintain his speed. The breakthrough came during a conversation with another driver at a truck stop in Oklahoma. Carl had been reluctant to discuss his experiences with anyone in his professional community, but exhaustion and desperation finally overcame his reservations. To his surprise, the other driver listened without judgment and shared his own similar experiences with command voices during his early years on the road. "The thing about those voices," the older driver explained while they shared coffee and pie in the truck stop diner, "is that they're not really trying to hurt you. They're trying to give you what they think you want, which is an end to the struggle. But they don't understand that struggling is part of living, and living is what makes the good moments worth having." Once I understood that, I could talk back to them with authority instead of fear. This perspective gave Carl a new framework for dealing with his auditory tormentors. Instead of simply resisting their suggestions or trying to ignore them, he began engaging them in philosophical discussions about the nature of existence, the value of perseverance, and the importance of hope even in difficult circumstances. The voices, which had seemed so wise and persuasive when he was afraid of them, began to reveal themselves as rather simplistic in their understanding of human experience. "You think ending the journey is the solution to the difficulties of traveling," Carl would say during these internal debates. "But the difficulties are what make the destinations meaningful. Without challenges, there's no sense of accomplishment. Without struggle, there's no growth. Without the lonely nights, I wouldn't appreciate the warmth of human connection when I do find it." Gradually, the voices began to lose their power over his thoughts and emotions. They still whispered their suggestions occasionally, but they had become more like background noise than compelling commands. Carl learned to acknowledge them without giving them authority, treating them as symptoms of stress rather than sources of wisdom or guidance. The most significant change came when Carl decided to modify his routes to include regular stops at a truck stop where a support group for drivers met weekly. The group, led by a retired driver who had overcome his own struggles with isolation and depression, provided a forum for honest discussion about the psychological challenges of long-haul trucking. Carl found that sharing his experiences with others who had faced similar battles helped diminish the voice's influence even further. "The road can be a lonely place," the group leader often said, "but loneliness is different from being alone. Loneliness is a choice, a habit of mind that we can change by reaching out and connecting with others. The voices you hear aren't your enemies, they're your mind's way of telling you that you need more human connection in your life." Through the support group, Carl developed friendships with other drivers who shared his routes, creating an informal network of mutual support and companionship. They would check in with each other via CB radio during long stretches of highway, share meals at truck stops, and even coordinate their schedules to travel together when possible. These connections provided the human contact that his mind had been craving, reducing the psychological pressure that had given birth to the command voices. Years later, Carl would reflect on his experience with the voices as a turning point in his life and career. They had forced him to confront the unhealthy isolation that had gradually consumed his existence, leading him to make changes that ultimately improved not just his mental health, but his overall quality of life. He began speaking at trucking industry conferences about mental health awareness, helping other drivers recognize the warning signs of psychological distress, and encouraging them to seek help before their situation became critical. The voices still visited him occasionally during particularly stressful periods or when he fell back into old patterns of poor self-care, but they no longer held any power over his actions. Carl had learned to hear them as reminders to pay attention to his mental and emotional needs, rather than as commands to be obeyed. The highway that had once seemed like a pathway to destruction had become a journey of self-discovery and healing, teaching him that even the most frightening internal experiences can become sources of wisdom and growth when faced with courage and understanding. Story 3. The Mirror's Deception. Thomas Wade had always prided himself on being a practical man, someone who dealt with the concrete realities of freight schedules, weather conditions, and mechanical maintenance, rather than dwelling on abstract concerns or supernatural nonsense. His 30-year career as a long-haul trucker had been built on this foundation of pragmatic thinking, and he approached every challenge with methodical precision and unwavering logic. So when he first noticed that his reflection in the truck's mirrors wasn't quite matching his actual movements, Thomas immediately assumed there was a simple explanation involving optical distortion or equipment malfunction. It began on a humid August morning in Louisiana, as Thomas was conducting his routine pre-trip inspection of his 18-wheeler. He stood beside the passenger side mirror, adjusting his baseball cap and checking his appearance before beginning another long day on the road. As he raised his right hand to scratch his beard, his reflection in the mirror raised its left hand to the same side of its face. The movement was subtle enough that Thomas initially dismissed it as a trick of lighting or perspective, but something about the discrepancy nagged at him throughout the morning. During his lunch break at a truck stop outside of Memphis, Thomas decided to investigate the phenomenon more thoroughly. He positioned himself directly in front of the mirror and performed a series of deliberate gestures, watching carefully to see if the reflection would accurately reproduce his movements. What he observed defied every rational explanation his practical mind could generate. When he waved his right hand, the reflection waved back with its right hand, creating the correct mirror image. But when he touched his left shoulder, the reflection touched its right shoulder, as if it were copying his movements from the same perspective rather than from the reversed viewpoint that mirrors should provide. Thomas spent several minutes testing different combinations of movements, growing increasingly disturbed by the inconsistencies he observed. Sometimes the reflection behaved normally, creating perfect mirror images of his actions. Other times it seemed to move independently, lagging behind his gestures by a fraction of a second, or adding subtle variations that he hadn't performed. Most unsettling of all were the moments when the reflection appeared to be moving before Thomas himself initiated the action, as if it were leading rather than following his movements. The rational part of Thomas's mind insisted that there had to be a logical explanation for these observations. Perhaps the mirror had been damaged in some way that created unusual optical effects. Maybe the mounting hardware was loose, causing vibrations that distorted the reflection. He examined the mirror housing carefully, checking for cracks in the glass or irregularities in the mounting system. But everything appeared to be in perfect working order. As the day progressed and Thomas continued his journey westward, he found himself glancing at the mirrors more frequently than usual, always watching for further evidence of the strange behavior he had witnessed. The reflection seemed to sense his scrutiny, behaving normally whenever he looked directly at it, but resuming its independent actions when he tried to observe it peripherally. This cat-and-mouse game between Thomas and his own reflection created a constant undercurrent of tension that made concentration difficult and increased his stress level significantly. That evening, as Thomas parked his truck at a rest area in Arkansas, he experienced the most disturbing episode yet. While preparing for sleep in his sleeper cabin, he caught sight of his reflection in the small mirror mounted above the sink. The reflection was performing its own nighttime routine, but with subtle differences that filled Thomas with inexplicable dread. Where Thomas was wearing a blue t-shirt, His reflection wore red. Where Thomas had removed his wedding ring and placed it in a small dish, his reflection still wore the ring on the wrong hand. Most chilling of all, the reflection's facial expression showed a contentment and peace that Thomas certainly wasn't feeling, as if it were living a different, happier version of his life. Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by disturbing dreams in which Thomas found himself trapped inside the mirror, watching helplessly as his reflection lived his life in the real world. In the dream, he pounded against the glass barrier, trying to alert the outside world to the deception taking place. But no one could hear his desperate pleas for help. The reflection version of himself went about daily routines with subtle improvements, making better decisions, showing more patience with difficult customers, and generally living the life that Thomas wished he could live, but somehow never managed to achieve. When morning came, Thomas was almost afraid to look in the mirrors, but professional necessity required him to complete his pre-trip inspection regardless of his personal anxieties. The reflection appeared normal during the daylight hours, faithfully reproducing his movements and expressions without any of the disturbing variations he had observed the previous day. Thomas began to hope that whatever had been causing the phenomenon had resolved itself naturally, perhaps due to temperature changes or some other environmental factor. But as evening approached and the shadows began to lengthen across the highway, the mirror's behavior resumed its disturbing pattern. During a fuel stop in Oklahoma, Thomas watched in fascination and horror as his reflection engaged in conversations with other truckers, while Thomas himself stood silently pumping diesel. The reflection appeared animated and friendly, gesturing enthusiastically and apparently sharing jokes that Thomas could see were well received by the other driver. Meanwhile, Thomas felt increasingly isolated and disconnected from the social interactions taking place around him. The realization dawned on him gradually that the reflection wasn't just moving independently, it was living independently, existing as a separate entity that shared his appearance, but possessed its own personality and motivations. This revelation brought with it a host of disturbing questions about the nature of identity and consciousness. If his reflection could exist separately from him, which one was the real Thomas Wade? Was he observing an alternate version of himself from a parallel dimension? Or was he himself the reflection of someone else's more authentic existence? Thomas began to notice that people responded differently to him depending on whether they were looking directly at him or at his reflection in mirrors or windows. Waitresses at truck stops seemed warmer and more attentive when serving him at tables positioned where they could see his reflection in the large windows. Other drivers appeared more willing to engage in conversation when they encountered him near his truck, where his reflection was visible in the polished chrome surfaces. The pattern suggested that his reflection projected a more appealing version of his personality, one that was more confident, more approachable, and more socially skilled than Thomas felt himself to be. This created a feedback loop of increasing self-doubt and social anxiety, as Thomas began to rely on his reflection's superior social abilities while simultaneously resenting his dependence on what he saw as a false representation of his true self. Late one night, while parked at a truck stop in New Mexico, Thomas decided to confront his reflection directly. He positioned himself in front of the large mirror mounted on the wall of the public restroom and began speaking to his reflection as if it were a separate person. To his surprise, the reflection appeared to respond, its lips moving in patterns that didn't match Thomas's own speech, as if it were engaged in a conversation that only it could hear. "What are you?" Thomas asked aloud, feeling slightly foolish but desperate for answers. "Are you me? Or am I you? Or are we both something else entirely?" The reflection's expression changed to one of profound sadness, and Thomas had the distinct impression that it was trying to communicate something important, but was constrained by the limitations of their shared existence. The reflection pointed to itself, then to Thomas, then gestured in a way that suggested unity or connection. It seemed to be trying to convey that they were two aspects of the same person, separated by some unknown force or circumstance, but still fundamentally linked. Over the following weeks, Thomas developed a complex relationship with his reflection. During daylight hours, when the reflection behaved normally, he felt like himself again, confident and capable of handling the challenges of his profession. But as darkness fell and the reflection resumed its independent behavior, Thomas felt increasingly like a passenger in his own life, watching helplessly as his alternate self lived a version of his existence that seemed more authentic and fulfilling than anything he could achieve on his own. The situation reached a crisis point during a delivery in California, when Thomas realized that his reflection was making decisions that affected his real-world circumstances. While Thomas had intended to refuse an additional load that would require him to drive through dangerous mountain conditions during a winter storm, his reflection had apparently accepted the assignment, leaving Thomas with paperwork he didn't remember signing and a delivery schedule he didn't remember agreeing to follow. This discovery forced Thomas to confront the possibility that his reflection wasn't just observing his life or living alongside it, it was actively interfering with his decision-making processes and potentially putting him in danger. The idea that his own image could betray him in such a fundamental way filled him with a terror that went beyond rational fear and entered the realm of existential dread. Thomas made the difficult decision to cover all the mirrors in his truck with towels and tape, eliminating his ability to see his reflection during the remainder of his journey. The immediate result was a profound sense of relief, as if he had been freed from the constant surveillance and judgment of his alternate self. But this relief was quickly replaced by practical difficulties, as he realized how much he depended on his mirrors for safe driving, parking, and backing maneuvers. The compromise solution he developed involved uncovering the mirrors only when absolutely necessary for safety purposes, while keeping them covered during routine activities and rest periods. This approach allowed him to function professionally while minimizing his exposure to the disturbing phenomenon that had been affecting his mental and emotional well-being. Gradually, Thomas began to understand that his experience with the mirror reflected deeper issues related to self-acceptance and authenticity. The reflection that had seemed so superior to his real self was actually a projection of his own potential, a visualization of the person he could become if he addressed the insecurities and limitations that held him back from fuller self-expression. Working with a counselor who specialized in helping people overcome social anxiety and self-doubt, Thomas learned to integrate the positive qualities he had observed in his reflection into his actual personality and behavior. Instead of seeing the reflection as a separate entity that was competing with him for control of his life, he began to view it as a mentor or guide that was showing him possibilities for personal growth and development. The process of integration was gradual and sometimes difficult, requiring Thomas to confront aspects of his personality that he had been avoiding or denying for years. But as he became more comfortable with authentic self-expression and social interaction, he noticed that his reflection began to behave more normally, no longer acting independently but simply mirroring his actual movements and expressions. Eventually, Thomas was able to uncover his mirrors permanently, without experiencing the disturbing phenomena that had plagued him for months. The reflection that looked back at him was clearly his own, but it was also the reflection of someone who had grown more confident, more socially skilled, and more comfortable with his own identity. The mirror had forced him to confront the gap between who he was and who he could be, ultimately leading to personal transformation that improved every aspect of his life, both on and off the road. Story 4. The Taste of Emptiness. Daniel Kemp had always been particular about his food, carrying a small arsenal of seasonings and hot sauces in his truck to transform the often bland offerings of highway diners and truck stop grills into something approaching palatability. His appreciation for good flavor had been one of the few constants in his nomadic lifestyle, a source of comfort and pleasure that helped offset the loneliness and monotony of long-haul trucking. So when every bite of food began tasting like ash in his mouth, Daniel knew something was fundamentally wrong with either his health or his perception of reality. The phenomenon began gradually on a Tuesday morning in Kansas as Daniel sat in a familiar diner where he had eaten breakfast dozens of times over the past 5 years. The waitress, a cheerful woman named Dolores who always remembered his preference for extra crispy bacon and black coffee, served him his usual order with her customary smile and friendly chatter about the weather and local gossip. But when Daniel took his first bite of what should have been perfectly seasoned scrambled eggs, the flavor that reached his taste buds was indistinguishable from the cold ash that remained in fireplaces after the flames had died. Initially, Daniel assumed the problem was with the food itself, perhaps the result of a kitchen accident or contaminated ingredients. He discreetly examined his plate, looking for signs of ash or other foreign substances, but the eggs appeared normal in every visual respect. Their texture was correct, their temperature was appropriate, and their appearance was exactly what he expected from his usual breakfast order. Only the taste was wrong, completely and utterly wrong, as if someone had replaced the food with crematorium remains while maintaining its outward appearance. Daniel quietly requested a replacement meal, explaining to Dolores that his original order seemed to have been contaminated somehow. She apologized profusely and brought him a fresh plate prepared by a different cook, but the result was identical. Every item on the replacement plate tasted like ash, from the bacon to the toast to the hash browns. Even his coffee, which had always been his most reliable source of flavor satisfaction, had taken on the same dead, powdery taste that reminded him uncomfortably of mortality and endings. Concerned about the possibility of a medical emergency, Daniel drove to the nearest urgent care clinic, where a young doctor conducted a thorough examination of his mouth, throat, and nasal passages. The doctor asked detailed questions about his symptoms, his medical history, and any medications or supplements he might be taking. After a comprehensive evaluation that included blood tests and a consultation with a specialist via telemedicine, the doctor could find no medical explanation for Daniel's sudden loss of taste perception. "Your taste buds appear to be functioning normally," the doctor explained while reviewing the test results. "Your sense of smell is intact, your oral health is excellent, and your blood work doesn't show any signs of infection, vitamin deficiency, or other conditions that typically affect taste perception. Sometimes stress or depression can alter how we experience food, but that usually involves reduced appetite rather than specific taste distortion." Despite the doctor's reassurances about his physical health, Daniel's condition continued to worsen as the days passed. Every meal became an exercise in forcing himself to consume nutrients that his body needed, but his mind rejected based on the horrible taste that accompanied every bite. The ash flavor was consistent across all foods, regardless of their actual composition, preparation method, or source. Fresh fruit from roadside stands tasted like ash. Expensive steaks from upscale restaurants tasted like ash. Even candy and ice cream, foods with such strong flavors that they should have overwhelmed any competing taste, were rendered inedible by the persistent ashy coating that seemed to coat his tongue and palate. The psychological impact of this condition proved to be as devastating as the physical consequences. Food had always been one of Daniel's primary sources of pleasure and comfort during his solitary journeys across the country. The ritual of discovering new restaurants, sampling regional specialties, and enjoying well-prepared meals had provided structure and anticipation to his otherwise routine existence. Without the ability to taste food properly, eating became nothing more than a mechanical necessity, a chore to be endured rather than an experience to be savored. Daniel's appetite diminished rapidly as his brain began to associate all food with the unpleasant ash taste, creating a negative feedback loop that made each meal more difficult than the last. He found himself losing weight at an alarming rate as his body struggled to maintain proper nutrition without the psychological satisfaction that normally accompanied eating. Sleep became his only escape from the constant reminder of his altered perception. But even his dreams began to be invaded by images of ash-covered landscapes and the taste of burned remains. He would wake with a flavor already coating his mouth, as if his subconscious mind had been dwelling on the phenomenon throughout the night. The boundary between sleeping and waking experiences became increasingly blurred as the ash taste became a constant presence in his consciousness. During a particularly difficult evening in Colorado, Daniel encountered another trucker at a rest area who observed his obvious distress and struck up a conversation. The older driver, a weathered man named Frank who had been on the road for over 30 years, listened with surprising understanding as Daniel described his bizarre condition. Instead of dismissing the story or suggesting medical solutions that Daniel had already pursued, Frank nodded knowingly and shared his own theory about the phenomenon. "I've heard about this before," Frank said quietly, glancing around to ensure their conversation remained private. "Always happens to drivers who've been on the road for a long time, usually during periods of major life changes or losses. The way I understand it, the ash taste isn't really about food at all. It's about everything in your life, starting to feel dead and empty, like you're just going through the motions without any real purpose or meaning." Frank's words resonated with Daniel in ways that medical explanations had not. The ash taste had indeed begun shortly after Daniel received news that his ex-wife had remarried and moved across the country with his teenage daughter, effectively ending his hopes for reconciliation and reducing his already limited contact with his child to occasional phone calls and holiday visits. The timing wasn't coincidental. It was symbolic of his growing sense that his life had been reduced to meaningless routines and empty relationships. As Daniel reflected on Frank's insight, he began to notice correlations between the intensity of the ash taste and his emotional state. During moments when he felt particularly lonely or disconnected from meaningful human contact, the taste became almost overwhelming, making it nearly impossible to eat anything at all. Conversely, during rare moments of genuine happiness or social connection, the taste would fade slightly, allowing him to enjoy small portions of food with something approaching normal flavor perception. This pattern suggested that the ash taste was indeed psychological rather than physical in origin, a manifestation of his mind's attempt to process feelings of emptiness and meaninglessness that he had been suppressing for years. The taste was literal in its symbolism, representing the ashes of burned bridges, failed relationships, and abandoned dreams that had accumulated in his consciousness like debris from a life that had lost its way. Understanding the symbolism didn't immediately cure Daniel's condition, but it did provide him with a framework for addressing the underlying issues that had created it. He began to examine his life choices more critically, questioning whether his dedication to long-haul trucking had come at the expense of relationships and experiences that might have given his existence more substance and meaning. The ash taste became a constant reminder that he was consuming emptiness rather than nourishment, both literally and metaphorically. Daniel started making deliberate changes to his lifestyle and priorities, beginning with small steps toward rebuilding connections with people who mattered to him. He arranged his schedule to spend more time with his daughter during her school breaks, even though it meant turning down lucrative long-distance hauls that would have kept him away from home for weeks at a time. He joined online communities for truckers dealing with isolation and depression, finding comfort in shared experiences and mutual support from others who understood the unique challenges of his profession. The process of reconnecting with meaningful relationships and activities was gradual and sometimes painful, requiring Daniel to confront aspects of his personality and lifestyle that had contributed to his isolation. He had to admit that his dedication to work had often been an excuse to avoid the vulnerability and commitment required for deep human connections. The ash taste served as a constant reminder of the consequences of emotional avoidance, forcing him to choose between continued isolation and the difficult work of building authentic relationships. Slowly, as Daniel invested more energy in nurturing his connections with family and friends, the ash taste began to lose its grip on his perception. Meals shared with his daughter during her visits started to taste normal again, as if the presence of genuine love and connection could override the symbolic manifestation of emptiness that had been poisoning his experience. Phone conversations with old friends who had remained loyal despite his years of emotional absence seemed to cleanse his palate, preparing him to taste food with something approaching normal appreciation. The breakthrough came during a Thanksgiving dinner that Daniel shared with his daughter and her stepfather, a man who had initially represented everything Daniel felt he had lost, but who gradually became a symbol of possibility and redemption. As they sat around the table, sharing stories and expressing gratitude for the good things in their lives, Daniel took a bite of turkey and experienced normal flavor. For the first time in months, the taste was so vivid and satisfying that tears came to his eyes, not just from relief, but from recognition of how much he had been missing during his period of self-imposed emotional exile. From that point forward, Daniel's recovery accelerated as he continued to prioritize relationships and meaningful experiences over the financial rewards and independence that had previously driven his career choices. The ash taste became an early warning system that alerted him when he was slipping back into patterns of isolation and emotional numbness, encouraging him to reach out to others and invest in activities that brought genuine satisfaction rather than mere distraction. Years later, Daniel would describe his experience with the ash taste as a gift disguised as a curse, a wake-up call that forced him to examine the emptiness that had gradually consumed his life and motivated him to make changes that ultimately led to greater happiness and fulfillment. Food became enjoyable again, not just because his taste perception returned to normal, but because meals became opportunities for connection and shared experience rather than solitary necessities to be endured alone. Story 5. The Blurring of Worlds. Rebecca Santos had always been a vivid dreamer, experiencing nocturnal adventures that were so detailed and emotionally compelling that she often woke feeling as though she had lived entirely separate lives during her sleeping hours. This gift for rich dream experiences had been a source of entertainment and creativity throughout her 15-year career as a long-haul trucker, providing her with mental escapes from the routine realities of highway driving and freight delivery schedules. But when the boundaries between her dreams and waking life began to dissolve, Rebecca discovered that her greatest source of mental refuge had transformed into something far more unsettling and dangerous. The phenomenon began subtly during a cross-country haul from California to Florida, as Rebecca found herself unable to determine whether certain recent experiences had occurred during her waking hours or while she slept in her truck's sleeper cabin. She had clear memories of stopping at a desert truck stop where she had helped a stranded motorist change a flat tire, sharing coffee and conversation with a woman who was traveling to her father's funeral. The memory was vivid and emotionally resonant, complete with specific details about the woman's appearance, her story of family reconciliation, and the gratitude she expressed for Rebecca's assistance. But when Rebecca tried to locate the receipt from the truck stop where this encounter had supposedly taken place, she could find no evidence that she had ever stopped at that particular location. Her logbook showed a continuous drive through that section of highway with no recorded breaks for fuel, food, or rest. Even more puzzling, when she called the truck stop to inquire about the incident, the manager informed her that no stranded motorists had been reported in their parking lot during the time period in question. Initially, Rebecca attributed the discrepancy to simple confusion or record-keeping errors, but similar incidents began occurring with increasing frequency as her journey continued. She would wake with detailed memories of conversations with other truckers, mechanical problems that required roadside assistance, and encounters with law enforcement officers conducting safety inspections. Yet physical evidence for these experiences was consistently absent, leaving Rebecca to question either her memory or her perception of reality. The most disturbing episode occurred near the Texas-Louisiana border, where Rebecca had a crystal-clear recollection of witnessing a serious accident involving multiple vehicles and staying at the scene to provide assistance until emergency responders arrived. She could remember every detail of the incident, The sound of screeching brakes, the acrid smell of burning rubber, the faces of the injured victims, and the chaos of rescue operations. The experience had been so traumatic that she had called her sister that evening to process the emotional impact of witnessing such devastation. But when Rebecca checked local news reports for coverage of the accident, she found no mention of any traffic incidents in that area during the relevant time period. Her phone records showed no outgoing calls to her sister, and when she contacted her sister directly, her sibling had no memory of receiving any distressing phone calls recently. The absence of any corroborating evidence for such a vivid and emotionally significant experience left Rebecca feeling deeply unsettled about the reliability of her own perceptions. As the pattern of phantom experiences continued, Rebecca began to notice that the boundary between sleeping and waking wasn't just blurred but seemed to be shifting continuously throughout her daily routine. She would find herself in the middle of complex conversations with people who weren't actually present, responding to CB radio calls that turned out to be imaginary, and navigating road conditions that existed only in her mind. The transitions between reality and dream state were so seamless that Rebecca often couldn't identify the moment when her perception had shifted from one to the other. The condition created significant safety concerns as Rebecca struggled to distinguish between real traffic situations and dream scenarios that required different responses. She would brake suddenly for obstacles that existed only in her imagined landscape, or fail to respond appropriately to actual hazards because she assumed they were part of an ongoing dream sequence. The cognitive dissonance between her internal experience and external reality created a constant state of uncertainty that made every aspect of driving more challenging and potentially dangerous. Rebecca sought help from a sleep specialist who conducted extensive testing to determine whether her condition was related to a specific sleep disorder or neurological problem. The tests revealed that Rebecca was experiencing an unusual form of REM sleep intrusion, where the vivid dreaming associated with rapid eye movement sleep was occurring during periods when she should have been fully awake. This condition, while rare, was sometimes observed in people who had experienced significant sleep deprivation over extended periods. Your brain is essentially trying to dream while you're awake, the specialists explained during their consultation. The isolation and irregular sleep patterns associated with long-haul trucking can disrupt your normal sleep-wake cycle to the point where different states of consciousness begin to overlap. Your mind is creating these vivid experiences as a way of processing the stress and loneliness of your lifestyle, but it's doing so during inappropriate times when you need to be fully alert and grounded in reality. The treatment plan involves significant changes to Rebecca's sleep hygiene and work schedule, including more regular sleep and wake times, longer rest periods between driving shifts, and techniques for maintaining awareness of her current state of consciousness. Rebecca also began keeping detailed logs of her experiences, noting the time, location, and circumstances of each incident to help identify patterns and triggers that might contribute to the confusion between dreams and reality. One of the most effective strategies involved developing a series of reality checks that Rebecca could perform whenever she suspected that her perception might be compromised. These checks included examining her hands for unusual appearance or behavior, reading text twice to see if it changed between readings, and verifying her location through GPS and physical landmark. While these techniques couldn't prevent the dream intrusions from occurring, they could help Rebecca identify when her perception was unreliable and take appropriate precautions. The emotional impact of the condition proved to be as challenging as the practical difficulties it created. The phantom experiences often involved meaningful social interactions and helping behaviors that provided Rebecca with a sense of purpose and connection that was largely absent from her actual daily routine. Learning that these satisfying experiences weren't real forced her to confront the extent of her loneliness and her deep need for meaningful human relationship. Rebecca began to understand that her mind was creating the rich social experiences she craved but couldn't find in her isolated professional environment. The dream intrusions weren't just random neurological misfiring. They were purposeful compensations for the emotional and social deprivation that had become chronic features of her lifestyle. This insight led her to make significant changes in how she structured her work and personal life to include more genuine human connection and social engagement. She started coordinating her routes with other drivers she had met through online trucking communities, creating opportunities for shared meals, conversation, and mutual support during long journeys. Rebecca also began volunteering at truck stops and travel centers during her mandatory rest periods, providing assistance to stranded motorists and fellow drivers who needed help with mechanical problems or navigation challenges. These activities gave her real opportunities to engage in the helping behaviors that had been so satisfying in her dream experiences. The frequency of dream intrusions decreased significantly as Rebecca's actual life became more emotionally fulfilling and socially connected. When they did occur, she was better equipped to recognize them quickly and respond appropriately without compromising her safety or well-being. The vivid dreaming that had once been a source of confusion and danger was gradually restored to its proper place as a nighttime phenomenon that enhanced her rest rather than disrupting her waking consciousness. Rebecca also discovered that keeping a dream journal helped her process the symbolic content of her sleeping experiences without confusing them with actual memories. Writing about her dreams immediately upon waking helped establish clear boundaries between different states of consciousness while preserving the creative and emotional benefits that had always made her dream life so rich and meaningful. The experience taught Rebecca valuable lessons about the importance of maintaining balance between solitude and social connection in her professional life. While the independence and freedom of long-haul trucking continued to appeal to her, she learned to structure her career in ways that provided regular opportunities for meaningful human interaction and community involvement. The boundary between dreams and reality remained distinct and appropriate, but both aspects of her consciousness continued to contribute to a life that felt rich, purposeful, and authentically her own. Over time, Rebecca developed a new appreciation for the complexity and resilience of human consciousness, recognizing that even disturbing psychological symptoms often represented her mind's attempt to meet important needs that weren't being addressed through conventional means. The dream intrusions that had once frightened her became a source of insight into her own psychological and emotional requirements, guiding her toward lifestyle changes that improved every aspect of her health and happiness. Story 6. When Exhaustion Creates Reality. The hallucinations began for Marcus Chen during his fourth consecutive day without proper sleep, manifesting first as subtle movements in his peripheral vision that he dismissed as fatigue-induced eye strain. Marcus had been pushing himself to complete a particularly lucrative series of back-to-back deliveries that would allow him to take an extended break for his daughter's wedding, but the demanding schedule had required him to operate on minimal rest and maximum doses of caffeine. He was experienced enough to recognize the early warning signs of dangerous exhaustion, but the financial incentive and emotional importance of his goal kept him pressing forward despite his body's increasingly urgent protests. The first hallucination to achieve full visual reality was a small girl in a red dress who appeared to be walking along the shoulder of Interstate 40 in New Mexico during the pre-dawn hours when traffic was sparse and visibility was limited. Marcus initially assumed she was a real child in distress and immediately pulled over to offer assistance, his parental instincts overriding any concerns about his own safety or schedule. But when he reached the location where he had seen her, there was no sign of anyone having been present. No footprints in the soft sand beside the highway, no discarded clothing or personal items that might have belonged to a stranded pedestrian. Marcus spent nearly an hour searching the area with a flashlight, calling out and listening for any response that might indicate someone was hiding or had fallen into one of the arroyos that bordered the roadway. The complete absence of any evidence for the child's existence forced him to confront the possibility that his exhausted mind was creating perceptions that had no basis in external reality. This realization filled him with profound unease, as he had always prided himself on his ability to maintain professional competence regardless of challenging circumstances. Despite his growing awareness that the girl had been a hallucination, Marcus found it impossible to simply dismiss the experience and continue his journey. The image of a lost child had triggered every protective instinct he possessed, and the possibility that he might encounter other people in distress created a moral dilemma that his exhausted mind struggled to resolve. If his hallucinations could create such compelling and emotionally charged scenarios, how could he trust his judgment about what was real and what required his intervention? As Marcus resumed driving, the hallucinations became more frequent and elaborate, populating his route with an entire cast of characters who seemed to exist in a parallel reality that only he could perceive. There was an elderly man with a broken-down pickup truck who waved frantically for assistance at every overpass, a group of teenagers whose car had run out of gas near a remote exit ramp, and a woman in nursing scrubs who appeared to be walking home from a hospital shift despite being dozens of miles from any medical facility. Each hallucinated encounter presented Marcus with the same ethical crisis, knowing that these people were probably figments of his imagination, but unable to ignore the possibility that his exhaustion was causing him to dismiss real people who genuinely needed help. The internal conflict between rational skepticism and moral responsibility created a state of constant anxiety that made concentration even more difficult and increased the likelihood of additional hallucinations. The turning point came when Marcus hallucinated an encounter with his own father, who had died 3 years earlier from complications related to diabetes. The elder Chen appeared in the passenger seat of Marcus's truck during a lonely stretch of highway in Arizona, looking exactly as he had during his final weeks of life, but speaking with the wisdom and perspective that Marcus associated with his father's younger, healthier years. "You're killing yourself for money that won't matter if you're not alive to spend it," his father said in the gentle but firm tone that Marcus remembered from childhood lectures about responsibility and priorities. "Your daughter would rather have her father present at her wedding than have him pay for an expensive ceremony from a hospital bed or a grave." The conversation felt completely real and emotionally authentic, addressing concerns that Marcus had been suppressing about his work-life balance and his tendency to sacrifice personal well-being for financial security. His father's advice was practical and loving, exactly the kind of guidance that Marcus needed to hear but had been unable to provide for himself in his current state of exhaustion and stress. When the hallucination ended and Marcus found himself alone in the cab again, he was forced to grapple with the possibility that his exhausted mind was not only creating false perceptions, but was using those perceptions to process important psychological and emotional issues that his conscious mind had been avoiding. The hallucinated conversation with his father had provided genuine insight and comfort, even though Marcus knew that the experience had no external reality. This realization led Marcus to a deeper understanding of the relationship between consciousness, perception, and psychological health. The hallucinations weren't just random misfiring of neural circuits. They were his mind's attempt to address unmet needs for social connection, moral purpose, and emotional processing that had been neglected due to his isolated and demanding work schedule. Marcus made the difficult decision to pull over at the next truck stop and call his dispatcher to explain that he needed to take mandatory rest time before continuing his delivery schedule. The conversation was uncomfortable, as it required him to admit that he had pushed himself beyond safe operating limits and potentially compromised his professional reliability. But the alternative, continuing to drive while experiencing vivid hallucinations, posed unacceptable risks to himself and other motorists. During his extended rest period, Marcus experienced the most intensive series of hallucinations of his entire journey. His sleeper cabin seemed to transform into a gathering place where family members, old friends, and significant figures from his past came to visit and share conversations that felt more real and meaningful than most of his actual daily interactions. These encounters allowed him to process grief about his father's death, anxiety about his daughter's upcoming wedding, and loneliness about his increasingly isolated lifestyle. The hallucinations served as a form of psychological therapy, providing Marcus with opportunities to explore emotions and relationships that he had been avoiding due to the demands of his work schedule and his own reluctance to appear vulnerable or needy. Through conversations with hallucinated versions of important people in his life, Marcus gained insights into his own values, priorities, and emotional needs that had been obscured by years of focusing primarily on financial and professional goals. When Marcus finally woke from his extended sleep period, the hallucinations had ceased completely, but their impact on his perspective and decision-making remained profound. He contacted his dispatcher again to request a modified delivery schedule that would allow him to reach his daughter's wedding with adequate time for rest and preparation. The company was understanding about his request, particularly when Marcus explained that his previous schedule had created safety concerns that could have resulted in accidents or regulatory violations. The wedding celebration became an opportunity for Marcus to implement the insights he had gained during his hallucinatory experiences. He was fully present for the event, engaging with family members and old friends in ways that reflected the deeper appreciation for relationships that his exhausted mind had helped him discover. The conversations were genuine and satisfying, providing the real-world fulfillment that had been missing from his life and reducing his psychological dependence on work as his primary source of identity and purpose. Following the wedding, Marcus made significant changes to his professional practices and personal priorities. He began scheduling more regular breaks and shorter consecutive driving periods, prioritizing safety and well-being over maximum earning potential. He also started maintaining more consistent contact with family and friends, recognizing that social isolation had contributed to the psychological conditions that made hallucinations more likely and more emotionally compelling. Marcus never experienced hallucinations with the same intensity again, but he retained a respectful awareness of his mind's capacity to create alternative realities when his basic needs for rest, connection, and emotional processing weren't being met through conventional means. The experience taught him to view psychological symptoms not as signs of weakness or failure, but as important communications from his unconscious mind about aspects of his life that required attention and care. Years later, Marcus would describe his period of sleep deprivation hallucinations as a crucial turning point that forced him to reevaluate his relationship with work, family, and personal health. The false perceptions that had initially frightened him ultimately led to more authentic and fulfilling real-world experiences, demonstrating the complex ways that even disturbing psychological phenomena can serve protective and adaptive functions when approached with courage and wisdom. Story 7. The Truck's Confessions. The first time Samuel Wright heard his truck speaking his deepest secrets aloud, he assumed that exhaustion had finally caught up with him after 30 years of long-haul driving across the endless highways of America. The voice emerged from somewhere deep within the cab during a lonely midnight stretch through Montana, speaking in a mechanical whisper that seemed to emanate from the dashboard, the seat cushions, and the very steel frame that surrounded him. But unlike the auditory hallucinations that other drivers had described during late-night conversations at truck stops, this voice knew things about Samuel's past that no one else could possibly know, secrets that he had never shared with another living soul. "You never told anyone about the money you found in your stepfather's jacket pocket the night he died," the voice said in a tone that was neither accusatory nor sympathetic, simply matter-of-fact in its revelation of truth. $800 in 20s and 50s that should have gone to your mother for the funeral expenses, but you kept it because you thought he owed you that much for all the years of beatings and humiliation. Samuel's hands tightened on the steering wheel as a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. The incident the voice described had occurred 25 years ago, and Samuel had never spoken of it to anyone, not even during the therapy sessions he had attended to deal with his childhood trauma. He had rationalized his decision at the time by telling himself that his stepfather's debts and drinking had cost the family far more than $800 over the years, but the guilt had nonetheless followed him through every major decision and relationship of his adult life. The truck continued its mechanical confession, revealing details about Samuel's private thoughts, hidden fears, and shameful behaviors with an accuracy that defied rational explanation. It spoke about the affair he had conducted during the early years of his marriage, the lies he had told to avoid responsibility for a minor accident that had damaged another driver's vehicle, and the cruel thoughts he harbored about people whose misfortunes he witnessed during his travels. Remember the family with the broken-down minivan outside of Tucson last summer? The voice continued relentlessly. You drove past without stopping because you assumed they were illegal immigrants and you didn't want to get involved with anything that might bring police attention. But you knew that father was desperate to get his sick child to a hospital, and you chose your own convenience over their emergency. Each revelation cut deeper than the last, forcing Samuel to confront aspects of his character that he had successfully hidden from others and largely ignored in his own self-reflection. The truck seemed to possess access to every moment of moral failure, every instance of selfishness or cowardice, every thought or action that contradicted the decent, hard-working image that Samuel projected to the world. As the nights passed and the confessions continued, Samuel began to understand that the voice wasn't randomly selecting incidents from his past, but was following a purposeful pattern that revealed the gradual erosion of his moral compass over the years. The truck was telling the story of how small compromises and rationalized selfishness had accumulated into a character that was far less admirable than Samuel wanted to believe. The psychological impact of these nightly revelation sessions was devastating to Samuel's self-esteem and emotional stability. Sleep became impossible as he lay in his sleeper cabin, waiting for the truck to resume its mechanical enumeration of his failures and shortcomings. He found himself driving in a state of constant anxiety, wondering what embarrassing or shameful incident would be the next to be exposed by his apparently omniscient vehicle. Samuel considered the possibility that the stress and isolation of his profession had finally caused him to experience a complete psychological breakdown, manifesting as auditory hallucinations that reflected his own suppressed guilt and self-criticism. But the voice's knowledge of specific details that Samuel himself had forgotten suggested that something more complex was occurring than simple mental illness or fatigue-induced confusion. During a fuel stop in Colorado, Samuel met another driver who listened with surprising understanding as Samuel cautiously described his experiences with the confessing truck. Instead of dismissing the story as evidence of mental instability, the older driver nodded knowingly and shared his own theory about what might be happening. Trucks absorb everything, the man explained while they shared coffee in the Travel Center diner. All the conversations, all the thoughts, all the emotions that happen inside them over the years. Sometimes when a driver's been carrying too much guilt or shame for too long, the truck starts reflecting it back like a mirror. It's not trying to punish you, it's trying to help you deal with stuff you've been avoiding. This perspective gave Samuel a new framework for understanding his experiences. Instead of viewing the truck's confessions as attacks on his character, he began to see them as opportunities for honest self-examination and potential redemption. The voice was forcing him to confront truths about himself that he had been avoiding, but confrontation was the first step toward change and growth. Samuel started responding to the truck's revelations with his own spoken acknowledgments of wrongdoing and commitments to better behavior in the future. These conversations felt strange and one-sided, but they provided a forum for processing guilt and shame that had been festering in his psyche for decades, without any outlet for resolution or healing. "You're right about the money," Samuel said aloud during one of these sessions. "I stole it because I was angry and hurt, but that doesn't justify taking something that wasn't mine. I should have given it to my mother like I knew was right. I'll find a way to make up for that mistake, maybe by helping other families who are struggling with funeral expenses." The truck's response to these acknowledgments was subtle, but noticeable. The mechanical voice became less harsh and judgmental, taking on a tone that was more supportive and encouraging. It began to balance its revelations of past failures with reminders of moments when Samuel had acted with kindness, courage or integrity, painting a more complete picture of his character that included both shadows and light. As Samuel continued to engage in honest dialogue with his confessing truck, he found that the experience was gradually transforming from a source of torment into a process of genuine healing and self-improvement. The voice was helping him identify patterns of behavior that had been undermining his relationships and self-respect, while also encouraging him to recognize his capacity for positive change and moral growth. The breakthrough came when the truck began helping Samuel plan specific actions he could take to address some of the wrongs he had committed or witnessed during his years on the road. It provided detailed information about how to contact people he had wronged, suggested charitable organizations that could benefit from his time and resources, and offered practical advice about how to develop better habits of empathy and social responsibility. Samuel followed through on many of these suggestions, reaching out to apologize for past mistakes, volunteering at truck stops to help stranded motorists, and making anonymous donations to causes that addressed problems he had previously ignored. Each positive action seemed to reduce the intensity and frequency of the truck's confessions, as if his efforts toward redemption were gradually satisfying whatever force or consciousness was driving the phenomenon. The most significant change occurred when Samuel used his experience with the confessing truck as the foundation for starting a support group for drivers who were struggling with guilt, depression, or other psychological challenges related to their profession. The group met regularly at truck stops along major routes, providing a forum for honest discussion about moral conflicts, ethical dilemmas, and personal failures that drivers had been carrying alone. Samuel discovered that his experience with the confessing truck was far from unique, though few drivers had been willing to discuss such incidents openly until he created a safe space for sharing. Many participants reported similar encounters with supernatural or psychological phenomena that had forced them to confront hidden aspects of their characters and behavior patterns. Through facilitating these discussions, Samuel learned that the trucking profession created unique conditions for moral isolation and ethical confusion that could lead to gradual character erosion if not addressed through community support and regular self-examination. The confessing truck had been his mind's way of initiating this process of moral inventory and spiritual renewal, using the vehicle that represented his livelihood as a symbol for the need to examine his life's direction and purpose. Eventually, the truck stopped speaking Samuel's secrets aloud, but the habit of honest self-reflection that the experience had established continued to guide his decision-making and behavior. He had learned to conduct his own moral inventory regularly, addressing ethical concerns and guilt before they could accumulate into the kind of psychological burden that had originally triggered his supernatural encounters. Years later, Samuel would describe his experience with the confessing truck as the most important spiritual awakening of his life, a forced confrontation with his own moral failings that ultimately led to genuine redemption and peace. The truck had been a harsh but ultimately loving teacher, using his own suppressed conscience to guide him toward a more authentic and ethical way of living, both on and off the road. Story 8. The Phantom Dispatcher. The phone calls always came at 3:17 a.m., precisely when Jake Morrison was entering his deepest sleep cycle in the cramped confines of his truck's sleeper cabin. The ringtone was identical to his company-issued phone, but when Jake checked the device, it remained silent and dark, showing no record of any incoming calls. Yet the ringing continued with mechanical persistence until Jake finally answered with a groggy, "Morrison here," only to hear the familiar voice of his dispatcher delivering urgent instructions for route changes, emergency deliveries, or safety warnings about road conditions ahead. "Jake, this is dispatch," the voice would say with the same professional tone and slight southern accent that characterized his actual dispatcher, a woman named Linda, who had been coordinating his loads for over 8 years. "We need you to take exit 47 instead of your planned route. There's been a chemical spill on I-35 that's going to close the highway for the next 6 hours. You'll need to add an extra 100 miles to your delivery schedule but it's the only way to reach your destination on time. These calls seem perfectly legitimate in every respect, except for their supernatural origin and their timing in the middle of his mandatory rest periods. The information provided was detailed and specific, including reference numbers for incident reports, alternative route suggestions that demonstrated intimate knowledge of highway systems, and delivery deadlines that matched Jake's actual schedule. The dispatcher's voice was indistinguishable from Linda's real communications, complete with her characteristic phrases and professional mannerisms. Jake initially assumed that his phone was malfunctioning, somehow playing back recorded conversations from previous calls, or creating auditory illusions due to electronic interference from other devices in his truck. He had the phone examined by technicians at electronic stores in 3 different cities, but each inspection revealed that the device was functioning normally with no signs of damage, programming errors, or unusual electromagnetic influences. The phantom calls began to affect Jake's sleep patterns and decision-making processes as he struggled to determine which dispatch instructions were real and which originated from his mysterious midnight caller. Some of the information provided during these supernatural communications proved to be accurate, leading him to successful route changes that avoided traffic delays or road hazards. Other times, following the phantom dispatcher's instructions led him to detours that added unnecessary miles and time to his deliveries without providing any apparent benefits. The psychological strain of constantly questioning the reality of his communications with dispatch created a state of chronic uncertainty that made every aspect of his job more stressful and confusing. Jake found himself calling his real dispatcher during normal business hours to verify information he had received during the phantom calls, leading to conversations that painted him as either forgetful or mentally unstable. "Jake, I never called you about any chemical spill on I-35. Linda would say with growing concern about his repeated requests for confirmation of conversations that had never occurred. "Are you getting enough sleep out there? Maybe you need to take some time off to rest and get yourself checked out by a doctor." The pattern of phantom calls intensified during periods when Jake was facing personal stress or professional challenges, suggesting that the phenomenon might be related to his psychological state rather than to any external supernatural forces. During his divorce proceedings, the phantom dispatcher called nightly with increasingly urgent and contradictory instructions that reflected Jake's own anxiety about making correct decisions under pressure. When his father was hospitalized with a heart attack, the calls became longer and more emotionally supportive, with the dispatcher offering personal advice and encouragement that went far beyond the scope of normal professional communications. "I know this is a difficult time for you, Jake," the phantom voice said during one particularly lengthy late-night call. "Family emergencies are always harder when you're on the road and can't be there in person. But remember that your work is important too, and sometimes the best way to help your family is to maintain your stability and income. Your father would want you to take care of your responsibilities." These personal communications felt genuinely comforting and helpful, providing the kind of emotional support that Jake needed, but wasn't receiving from his actual professional relationships or personal connections. The phantom dispatcher seemed to understand his struggles with work-life balance, his guilt about missing important family events, and his fears about financial security, in ways that his real dispatcher couldn't or wouldn't address. Jake began to look forward to these midnight conversations, even though he understood that they weren't real in any conventional sense. The phantom dispatcher became a trusted advisor and emotional confidant, offering guidance that was often more insightful and personally relevant than anything he received from actual human relationships. This dependency on supernatural communication created its own set of problems, as Jake became increasingly isolated from real human connections, while investing more emotional energy in his relationship with a voice that existed only in his own mind. The situation reached a crisis point when Jake began making major life decisions based on advice from the phantom dispatcher, including accepting a job transfer that relocated him hundreds of miles from his family and declining opportunities for career advancement that the voice advised against. These choices had real-world consequences that affected his relationships, financial situation, and professional development in ways that couldn't be easily reversed. Jake's sister, who had been concerned about his increasingly erratic behavior and poor decision-making, convinced him to seek help from a counselor who specialized in helping people deal with work stress and social isolation. The counseling sessions revealed that the Phantom Dispatcher was Jake's unconscious mind's attempt to create the kind of supportive, knowledgeable authority figure that he desperately needed, but wasn't finding in his actual professional or personal relationships. "You've created an idealized version of professional support," the counselor explained during one of their sessions. "This Phantom Dispatcher represents everything you wish you could get from your real work environment: personal attention, emotional understanding, flexible guidance, and someone who truly cares about your well-being beyond just your productivity." The fact that these calls come during your most vulnerable hours suggests that your mind is trying to provide comfort and direction when you feel most alone and uncertain. Understanding the psychological function of the phantom calls helped Jake develop healthier strategies for meeting his needs for guidance and support. He began building stronger relationships with other drivers through online communities and regular meetups at truck stops, creating a network of real human connections that could provide some of the emotional support he had been seeking from his supernatural dispatcher. Jake also worked with his actual dispatcher to establish more regular check-ins and clearer communication protocols that reduced his anxiety about route decisions and schedule changes. By addressing the professional uncertainties that had contributed to his psychological distress, he was able to reduce his dependence on the phantom calls for guidance and reassurance. The frequency of midnight calls gradually decreased as Jake's real-world support systems became more robust and reliable. When the Phantom Dispatcher did call, Jake learned to appreciate the communication as a sign that he needed to pay attention to his emotional needs and seek out actual human connections rather than relying solely on his own psychological resources. Eventually, the phantom calls stopped entirely, but Jake retained the insights he had gained about the importance of seeking support and guidance from real relationships, rather than withdrawing into isolation when facing challenges. The experience taught him that even psychological symptoms that seemed purely supernatural often served important functions in highlighting unmet needs and pointing toward healthier ways of living and working. Story 9. The Midnight Visitor. The knocking always began softly, like raindrops against the aluminum door of Martin Chambers' truck cab, gentle enough that he initially mistook the sound for natural weather phenomena or the settling noises that large vehicles made during temperature changes. But the rhythm was too deliberate, too purposeful to be random, following the unmistakable pattern of someone requesting entry with the polite persistence of a visitor who knew they would eventually be acknowledged. Martin had been parking at the same rest area in Nevada for over 5 years, using the isolated location as his regular overnight stop during cross-country hauls between California and the East Coast. The area was peaceful and secure, far enough from major cities to avoid the noise and congestion of busy truck stops, but close enough to services that he could resupply when necessary. He had never experienced any problems with crime or unwanted visitors during his stops there, which made the mysterious knocking all the more unsettling and inexplicable. The first incident occurred on a Tuesday night in October, as Martin was settling into a sleeper cabin after a long day of driving through desert highways. The gentle tapping at his door seemed so natural and expected that he automatically called out, "Just a minute," while putting on his shoes and preparing to see who needed assistance. When he opened the door, however, the small parking area was completely empty, except for his own truck and the distant glow of security lights illuminating the rest facilities. Martin spent several minutes searching the area with a flashlight, checking behind buildings and vehicles for any sign of the person who had been knocking. The absence of footprints in the sandy soil around his truck suggested that no one had approached his vehicle. Yet the knocking had been so clear and distinct that Martin couldn't dismiss it as imagination or auditory hallucination. The knocking returned the following week, this time more insistent and accompanied by what sounded like muffled speech from someone standing just outside his door. Martin could almost make out words, fragments of conversation that seemed to be directed at him personally, but the sounds were too indistinct to understand clearly. When he opened the door, the result was the same: empty darkness and no evidence that anyone had been present. As the weeks passed, the phantom visitor's nocturnal visits became a regular feature of Martin's stays at the rest area. The knocking would begin around midnight and continue intermittently until dawn, sometimes soft and patient, other times urgent and demanding. The muffled voice gradually became clearer, revealing what sounded like a young woman calling his name and asking for help in increasingly desperate tones. "Martin, please open the door," the voice would plead with heartbreaking sincerity. "I'm lost, and I don't have anywhere else to go. I just need someone to help me find my way home. Please, don't leave me out here alone." The emotional appeal of these requests created intense internal conflict for Martin, who had always prided himself on his willingness to help travelers in distress. Every instinct told him to respond to the woman's pleas for assistance, but his eyes and other senses provided no confirmation that anyone was actually present outside his truck. The disconnect between his auditory perception and visual reality created a state of constant confusion and anxiety that made restful sleep impossible. Martin began researching the history of the rest area, wondering if some past tragedy might explain the persistent presence he was experiencing. Local records revealed that the location had been the site of several accidents over the years, including a fatal collision involving a young woman whose car had skidded off the highway during a winter storm. The woman had died from her injuries while waiting for emergency responders to reach the remote location, calling out for help that arrived too late to save her life. This discovery provided a potential explanation for the phantom knocking and voice, but it also raised disturbing questions about the nature of consciousness and the possibility that traumatic deaths might leave some form of spiritual residue in the locations where they occurred. Martin had never considered himself particularly susceptible to supernatural experiences, but the consistency and emotional intensity of his encounters at the rest area challenged his materialistic worldview. The psychological impact of these nightly visitations began to affect Martin's overall mental health and professional performance. Sleep deprivation from the interrupted nights made concentration difficult during his driving hours, while anxiety about the evening encounters created a constant state of nervous tension that affected his appetite, mood, and social interactions. Martin considered changing his route to avoid the haunted rest area, but financial pressures and scheduling constraints made alternative stops impractical. The location was perfectly positioned for his delivery schedule, and finding comparable parking elsewhere would require significant changes to his route that would reduce his earning potential and increase his travel time. Instead, Martin decided to confront the phenomenon directly by attempting to communicate with whatever consciousness was producing the knocking and voice. During the next visitation, instead of opening the door or searching for a physical presence, Martin spoke aloud to the visitor while remaining safely inside his cab. "I can hear you calling for help," he said clearly, "but I don't know how to help someone I can't see or touch. If you're really there, you need to tell me what you need and how I can provide it from where I am." The response was immediate and surprisingly coherent. The woman's voice explained that she had been trapped at the rest area since the night of her accident, unable to move on because she had never received the help she had been calling for when she died. She didn't need physical assistance, but rather acknowledgement and compassion from someone who could hear her distress and validate her experience of being lost and afraid. "I just need someone to know that I was here," the voice said with profound sadness. "I need someone to remember that I was trying to get home to my family when the accident happened. I've been calling for help for so long, but everyone just drives away without hearing me." This explanation resonated with Martin's understanding of human psychology and the importance of being witnessed and acknowledged during times of crisis. He began spending time each evening talking with the phantom woman, listening to her story about the night she died and offering the compassion and understanding that she had been seeking for years. These conversations became surprisingly therapeutic for both participants. The woman found peace in having her experience validated and her memory honored, while Martin discovered that his role as listener and witness gave his stop at the rest area a sense of purpose that transcended mere convenience. He was providing a service that no one else could offer, bringing comfort to a consciousness that had been isolated and ignored for far too long. Over time, the desperate quality of the woman's pleas transformed into expressions of gratitude and friendship. She began sharing stories about her life before the accident, her dreams and hopes, her family relationships, and her reflections on the meaning of existence from her current unusual perspective. These conversations provided Martin with insights into mortality, compassion, and the enduring power of human connection that enriched his understanding of his own life and relationships. The nightly visitations gradually became less frequent as the woman's need for acknowledgement was satisfied through Martin's compassionate attention. When the knocking did occur, it was gentle and brief, more like a friendly greeting than a desperate plea for help. The voice expressed appreciation for Martin's willingness to listen and comfort rather than fear or dismissal. Eventually, the phantom visitations ceased entirely, but Martin continued to stop at the rest area as a form of memorial to the woman whose spirit he had helped find peace. He placed a small plaque near the location where her accident had occurred, honoring her memory and acknowledging the tragedy that had kept her consciousness bound to the location for so many years. Martin's experience with the midnight visitor taught him valuable lessons about the importance of witnessing and acknowledgement in healing psychological and spiritual wounds. He began volunteering with organizations that provided support to families dealing with sudden loss, using his experience to help others understand that the need to be heard and remembered extends beyond death and can be satisfied through compassionate listening and memorial recognition. The phantom knocking never returned, but Martin retained a heightened sensitivity to the presence of people in distress, whether living or deceased. His encounter with the lost spirit had opened his awareness to forms of communication and consciousness that existed beyond conventional perception, enriching his spiritual life and increasing his capacity for empathy and service to others who needed acknowledgement and compassion. Story 10. The Passenger Who Never Left. The woman appeared in Theodore Walsh's passenger seat on a rainy Thursday evening near the Oregon-Washington border, materializing so naturally that Theodore initially assumed she had been there all along and he had simply failed to notice her presence due to the poor visibility and his concentration on navigating treacherous mountain curves. She was elderly, perhaps in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and wearing a flower print dress that seemed more appropriate for church services than highway travel. "Thank you for picking me up, dear," she said, in a gentle voice that carried the slight accent of someone who had emigrated to America decades earlier. "I've been waiting by the roadside for quite some time, and I was beginning to worry that no one would stop to offer assistance. These modern highways can be such lonely places for someone in my situation." Theodore glanced quickly at his passenger, confusion clouding his thoughts as he tried to remember when he had stopped to pick up a hitchhiker. His company had strict policies against providing rides to unauthorized passengers, and Theodore had always been scrupulous about following safety protocols and corporate regulations. The idea that he would have made such an impulsive decision to offer assistance to a stranger was completely contrary to his normal behavior and professional standards. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Theodore said cautiously, "but I don't remember stopping to pick you up. When did you get into my truck? I didn't see anyone by the roadside when I came through this area." The woman smiled kindly and patted his arm with a gesture that felt both comforting and proprietary. "Oh, you drivers work so hard and cover so many miles that it's natural for you to lose track of the details. You stopped about 20 miles back, near that little town with the antique shop and the diner that serves the wonderful apple pie. I was so grateful when you pulled over because my arthritis makes it difficult for me to walk long distances, especially in weather like this." Theodore had no memory of stopping at any town in the past 50 miles, but the woman's description was detailed enough to suggest that she was recalling an actual location rather than fabricating a story. He began to wonder if the stress and fatigue of his demanding schedule had caused him to experience a brief blackout or memory lapse that had erased his recollection of picking up his passenger. As they continued driving through the mountain pass, the woman began sharing stories about her life, her family, and her reasons for traveling. She spoke about visiting her daughter in Portland, about grandchildren she hadn't seen in months, and about the changes she had witnessed in the American Northwest during her many decades of residence there. Her conversation was engaging and detailed, filled with specific references to local landmarks, historical events, and cultural changes that demonstrated intimate knowledge of the region. "I remember when this highway was just a 2-lane road," she said, while gazing out at the landscape passing by in the darkness. "My late husband and I used to drive this route every summer to visit his family in Seattle. The road was so narrow and winding that the trip took twice as long, but we didn't mind because we enjoyed the conversation and the scenery." People took more time to appreciate the journey in those days. The woman's presence began to feel comforting and familiar, as if she were a beloved grandmother sharing wisdom and memories with a favorite grandchild. Theodore found himself looking forward to her stories and observations, which provided a welcome distraction from the loneliness and monotony that characterized much of his long-haul driving experience. But as the hours passed and they approached the Portland metropolitan area, Theodore began to notice inconsistencies in his passenger's stories that suggested her situation was more complex than it initially appeared. She spoke about current events and cultural changes as if she were still actively participating in contemporary life, but some of her references were dated by several decades, as if her most vivid memories came from an earlier era that had ended long ago. "My daughter works at one of those new computer companies," the woman said during one conversation about modern technology. "She's always trying to explain to me how these electronic machines are going to change the way people communicate and do business. I told her that nothing will ever replace the personal touch of face-to-face conversation and handwritten letters, but young people today seem to think that faster is always better." The computer companies she described sounded like the emerging technology firms of the 1980s, rather than the established corporations of the current era. And her daughter's age, based on the woman's apparent age, would suggest someone who was approaching retirement rather than building a career in a rapidly evolving industry. When Theodore asked for specific directions to his passenger's destination, the woman provided an address that navigation systems couldn't locate and street names that didn't appear on current maps of the Portland area. She seemed confused and distressed by this difficulty, insisting that she had lived at the same address for over 30 years and couldn't understand why modern technology was unable to find her neighborhood. "Perhaps the electronic maps haven't been updated recently," she suggested, with a kind of gentle confusion that elderly people sometimes display when confronted with technological limitations. "My neighborhood is well established, with mature trees and houses that have been there since the 1950s. It's not some new development that might not be in your computer system yet." Theodore began to suspect that his passenger might be suffering from dementia or some other condition that affected her memory and perception of current reality. Her stories were internally consistent, but seemed to be drawn from a time period that had ended years or even decades ago. The possibility that he was transporting someone who was mentally incapacitated raised ethical and legal concerns about his responsibility for her safety and well-being. As they entered the Portland city limits, Theodore decided to contact local authorities to report his situation and seek guidance about how to ensure his passenger's safety. But when he reached for his phone to make the call, the woman had vanished completely from the passenger's seat, leaving no trace of her presence except for the faint scent of lavender perfume and the lingering warmth where she had been sitting. Theodore pulled over at the first available parking area and searched his entire truck thoroughly, checking the sleeper cabin, storage compartments, and even the space behind the seats. There was no sign that anyone had been in his vehicle except for himself. No personal belongings left behind. No physical evidence that his passenger had ever existed outside of his own perception and memory. The realization that he had been conversing with a hallucination for several hours was deeply unsettling, particularly because the experience had felt completely real and emotionally satisfying. The woman's stories, personality, and physical presence had been so convincing that Theodore found it difficult to accept that his mind could have created such a detailed and consistent false reality. Theodore contacted his dispatcher to report the incident and request guidance about whether he should seek medical evaluation before continuing his delivery schedule. The conversation was uncomfortable, as it required him to admit that he had experienced what might be signs of serious psychological disturbance while operating a commercial vehicle. During his mandatory rest period, Theodore researched phantom passenger phenomena and discovered that his experience was far from unique among long-haul drivers. Many truckers reported similar encounters with passengers who appeared and disappeared without explanation, often during periods of stress, loneliness, or emotional transition. These experiences were frequently benign and even comforting, suggesting that they might serve psychological functions related to companionship and social connection. Theodore began to understand that his phantom passenger had appeared during a particularly difficult period in his personal life, when his recent divorce had left him feeling isolated and disconnected from meaningful relationships. The elderly woman had provided the kind of warm, accepting companionship that he had been missing, allowing him to experience conversation and human connection without the complications and vulnerabilities that characterized his real-world relationships. The experience taught Theodore important lessons about his own emotional needs and the dangers of extreme social isolation. He began making more effort to maintain contact with family and friends, scheduling regular phone calls and video chats that provided genuine human connection during his long journeys. He also started participating in online communities for truckers, sharing experiences and building relationships with other drivers who understood the unique challenges of his profession. While Theodore never encountered his phantom passenger again, he retained fond memories of their conversations and the comfort her presence had provided during a lonely and difficult time. The experience had shown him the power of his own mind to create the companionship he needed, but it had also motivated him to seek real relationships that could provide authentic and lasting connection. Years later, Theodore would describe his encounter with the phantom passenger as a turning point that helped him recognize the importance of social connection in maintaining psychological health and professional safety. The woman who had never really been there had taught him valuable lessons about loneliness, memory, and the human need for compassionate companionship that guided his approach to relationships for the rest of his career and life. Story 11. Dancing Shadows in the Headlights. The shadows began behaving strangely for Robert Chin on a moonless night in West Texas, where the flat landscape stretched endlessly in all directions under a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch. Robert had been driving this route for over 12 years and was intimately familiar with the way his headlights illuminated the road ahead, creating predictable patterns of light and shadow that helped him navigate the darkness safely and efficiently. But tonight, the shadows cast by his truck's powerful LED headlights were moving independently of their sources, stretching and contracting in ways that defy the laws of physics and optical science. At first, Robert assumed that fatigue was affecting his perception, causing him to misinterpret the normal movement of shadows as vehicles passed in opposite directions, or as his truck navigated gentle curves in the otherwise straight highway. The desert could play tricks on anyone's mind, especially during late-night hours, when the vast emptiness and hypnotic rhythm of highway driving could induce a trance-like state that distorted sensory input and spatial awareness. But as Robert watched more carefully, the shadow anomalies became impossible to dismiss as simple misperception or visual fatigue. The shadow of a roadside fence post stretched across the highway like a dark ribbon, extending far beyond what the actual post's height and the angle of his headlights should have produced. The shadow of his own truck, visible in his side mirrors when reflected light hit surfaces at the proper angle, appeared to be several times larger than his actual vehicle, looming behind him like a massive specter that dwarfed the already substantial 18-wheeler he was driving. Most disturbing of all were the shadows that seemed to have no corresponding physical objects to cast them. Dark shapes moved across the illuminated portion of the highway, resembling the silhouettes of running figures, flying creatures, and moving vehicles that existed nowhere in the visible landscape. These phantom shadows appeared and disappeared with fluid grace, creating a shadow play that was both beautiful and terrifying in its complete disconnection from observable reality. Robert reduced his speed and increased his attention to the road ahead, concerned that the shadow distortions might be obscuring real hazards or obstacles that could create dangerous driving conditions. But the highway surface remained clear and well-maintained, with no evidence of the debris, animals, or other objects that the shadows seemed to represent. The disconnect between the shadow world and the physical world created a dual reality that made navigation increasingly challenging and psychologically unsettling. As the night progressed, the shadow phenomena became more elaborate and interactive, responding to Robert's movements and decisions in ways that suggested conscious awareness of his presence. When he changed lanes, the shadows would shift and reorganize themselves to accommodate his new position. When he adjusted his speed, the shadows would accelerate or decelerate to maintain their relative positions within his headlight beams. The most unnerving development was when the shadows began to form recognizable shapes and scenes that seemed designed to capture Robert's attention and provoke emotional responses. He saw shadow figures waving from the roadside, shadow animals crossing the highway, and shadow vehicles approaching from impossible angles that would have required them to be driving vertically up the sides of non-existent hills or through the empty air above the desert floor. Robert began speaking aloud to himself, providing a running commentary on his observations in an attempt to maintain his connection to reality and resist the hypnotic pull of the shadow world that was unfolding in his headlight beams. "The shadows are not real," he repeated like a mantra. "They're just tricks of light and tired eyes. Focus on the actual road, the real lane markers, the genuine obstacles that could actually cause problems." But even as Robert intellectually understood that the shadows were hallucinations or perceptual distortions, he found himself emotionally drawn into their mysterious dance. The shadow figures seemed to be trying to communicate something important, reaching toward his truck with gestures that appeared urgent and pleading. The shadow animals moved with grace and purpose that suggested intelligence and intention rather than random neural misfiring or optical illusion. During a fuel stop at an isolated truck stop, Robert described his experiences to another driver who had been traveling the same route. Instead of dismissing Robert's account as evidence of exhaustion or mental instability, the older driver nodded with understanding and shared his own similar encounters with unusual shadow phenomena during night driving through remote areas. "The desert changes the way light behaves," the man explained while they shared coffee in the truck stop diner. "All that empty space and dry air create conditions that can bend and stretch shadows in ways that don't happen in more populated areas. But I think there's more to it than just physics. Some places hold on to the shadows of things that happened there in the past, especially places where people died or suffered without anyone knowing about it." This perspective gave Robert a new framework for understanding his shadow encounters. The West Texas desert had been the site of countless tragedies over the centuries. Native American conflicts, pioneer hardships, military exercises, drug trafficking violence, and immigration struggles. The shadows he was seeing might be echoes of past events, impressions left in the landscape by intense human experiences that had occurred in the darkness where his headlights now illuminated. Robert began to approach the shadow phenomena with respectful curiosity rather than fear or dismissal. He started acknowledging the shadow figures with gentle waves and spoken greetings, treating them as he might treat any travelers he encountered on the highway. This change in attitude seemed to calm the more aggressive and attention-seeking shadow behaviors, replacing them with more peaceful and contemplative movement. The shadow animals became particularly responsive to Robert's respectful acknowledgement, moving alongside his truck for miles at a time like ghostly escorts protecting him during his journey through their territory. Shadow deer bounded gracefully through his headlight beams, shadow birds soared overhead in formation, and shadow horses galloped across the desert floor with wild freedom that spoke to something primal and beautiful in the landscape's hidden life. Robert developed a ritual of offering silent prayers or meditations for the people and animals whose shadows he encountered, recognizing that his headlights might be illuminating the final moments or most significant experiences of beings who had lived and died in this remote landscape. The practice transformed his night driving from a solitary endurance test into a form of moving memorial service that honored the history and mystery of the places through which he traveled. The shadow phenomena gradually became less frequent and intense as Robert's attitude shifted from resistance to acceptance and respect. When shadows did appear, they were more subtle and peaceful, adding mystery and beauty to his night driving experience rather than creating anxiety and confusion. Robert learned to navigate by the real world while appreciating the shadow world as a parallel dimension that enriched his understanding of the landscape's deeper significance. Over time, Robert became known among other drivers for his knowledge of West Texas highway conditions and his ability to travel safely through the region during challenging weather and visibility conditions. His experience with the shadow phenomena had enhanced his night vision and spatial awareness, teaching him to distinguish between real hazards and phantom threats while maintaining respect for the unknown forces that influenced his driving environment. Robert continued to encounter unusual shadow formations throughout his career, but they never again created the fear and confusion that had characterized his initial experiences. He had learned to see them as part of the landscape's natural mystery, phenomena that added depth and meaning to his travels without threatening his safety or professional competence. The shadow encounters taught Robert valuable lessons about perception, respect, and the importance of maintaining openness to experiences that couldn't be easily explained through conventional understanding. His willingness to acknowledge and honor the shadow world had transformed a potentially dangerous psychological phenomenon into a source of spiritual enrichment and professional enhancement that improved every aspect of his life on the road. Story 12. The Self-Writing Logbook. Douglas Fleming had always been meticulous about maintaining his driving logs, recording every mile, every rest period, and every fuel stop, with a precision that 25 years in the trucking industry had taught him was essential for regulatory compliance and professional success. His logbook was a model of accuracy and organization, a document that could withstand the scrutiny of any Department of Transportation inspection and serve as a reliable record of his professional activities and whereabouts. So when Douglas discovered that his logbook was writing itself, adding entries in his own handwriting for trips he had never taken and conversations he had never had, he knew that something fundamental about his reality had shifted in ways that challenged his understanding of consciousness, memory, and the nature of recorded truth. The phenomenon began subtly on a Monday morning in Missouri, when Douglas noticed that his previous day's entry included details about a rest stop in Kansas that he couldn't remember visiting. According to the logbook, he had stopped at a truck stop near Salina, purchased fuel, and had a conversation with another driver about road conditions in Colorado. The entry was written in Douglas's characteristic handwriting, complete with his typical abbreviations and the small sketches he occasionally drew in the margins to illustrate interesting sights or unusual weather conditions. Douglas examined the entry carefully, looking for signs that someone else might have written in his logbook as a prank or practical joke. But the handwriting was unmistakably his own, down to the specific way he formed certain letters and the slight rightward slant that had characterized his writing since childhood. Even more convincing was the inclusion of personal thoughts and observations that only Douglas would have recorded, such as his concern about his truck's fuel efficiency and his satisfaction with making good time despite road construction delays. Initially, Douglas assumed that he was experiencing memory problems, perhaps related to stress or fatigue, that was causing him to forget routine stops and activities. He had heard about truckers developing cognitive issues after years of irregular sleep and high-pressure schedules, and he wondered if his meticulous record-keeping habits were somehow continuing even when his conscious mind wasn't fully engaged with the process. But as the phantom entries became more frequent and elaborate, Douglas realized that the logbook was recording experiences that he couldn't possibly have forgotten, even if his memory was compromised. The book described detailed conversations with specific people, documented mechanical problems that would have required significant time and money to address, and recorded weather conditions that differed dramatically from what Douglas actually experienced during his travels. One particularly disturbing entry described Douglas stopping to assist at a serious traffic accident near Oklahoma City, providing first aid to injured victims and giving a statement to police officers who responded to the scene. The entry included specific details about the injured parties, the cause of the accident, and the emotional impact that witnessing such trauma had on Douglas's mental state. According to the logbook, the incident had affected him so deeply that he had called his sister that evening to process his feelings about mortality and the fragility of human life. Douglas had no memory of witnessing any accident, providing first aid, or calling his sister. When he contacted his sister to ask about their conversation, she confirmed that no such call had taken place. Local news reports and police records showed no major traffic accidents in the Oklahoma City area during the time period described in his logbook. Yet the entry was written in Douglas's own hand with emotional authenticity and specific detail that suggested genuine personal experience. The self-writing logbook began to document an alternate version of Douglas's professional life, one in which he was more socially engaged, more helpful to other travelers, and more emotionally expressive than his actual personality typically allowed. The Phantom Douglas described in these entries stopped frequently to assist stranded motorists, engaged in lengthy philosophical conversations with other truckers, and regularly called family members to share experiences and maintain emotional connections. This alternate version of himself was clearly an idealized projection of the person Douglas wished he could be, but felt too shy, too busy, or too emotionally guarded to become in reality. The logbook was documenting not his actual experiences, but his aspirational experiences, recording the kind of meaningful and socially connected life that he secretly longed for, but rarely achieved in his day-to-day existence. Douglas began to study the phantom entries as a window into his own unconscious desires and values, recognizing that his hand was somehow recording experiences that reflected his deepest wishes for personal growth and social connection. The self-writing phenomenon was forcing him to confront the gap between his actual behavior and his ideal behavior, showing him possibilities for a more fulfilling and authentic way of living and working. The turning point came when Douglas decided to try living more like the phantom version of himself described in the logbook entries. Instead of avoiding social interactions and focusing solely on efficient trip completion, he began stopping to help stranded motorists, engaging in conversations with other drivers, and making the phone calls to family members that his logbook claimed he was already making. To his surprise, Douglas discovered that these behaviors came more naturally than he had expected, and provided emotional satisfaction that far exceeded the minor inconveniences they created in his schedule. The real-world experiences he began having closely matched the phantom experiences described in his logbook, as if the book had been providing a script or guidebook for a more fulfilling way of living. As Douglas's actual behavior began to align with the aspirational experiences recorded in his logbook, the frequency of phantom entries decreased dramatically. The book seemed to recognize that its purpose as a catalyst for personal growth had been achieved, and that Douglas no longer needed supernatural guidance to live the kind of life he truly wanted. The final phantom entry appeared on a Thursday evening in Pennsylvania, written in Douglas's handwriting but expressing thoughts that felt like a message from his own higher self. Today I realize that the person I've been pretending to be in this logbook is the person I actually am when I stop being afraid of connection and vulnerability. The experiences I thought I was imagining were actually memories of the future, showing me who I could become if I had the courage to step outside my comfort zone and engage fully with the world around me. Douglas kept the logbook with its phantom entries as a reminder of the transformation that had occurred in his life and perspective. The self-writing phenomenon had served as a form of unconscious coaching, guiding him toward behaviors and attitudes that aligned with his deepest values, and brought greater meaning and satisfaction to his professional and personal relationships. Years later, Douglas would describe the self-writing logbook as the most effective teacher he had ever encountered, a manifestation of his own wisdom that had found a way to communicate with his conscious mind through the medium of familiar record-keeping practices. The phantom entries had shown him that personal growth often requires external prompts or unusual circumstances to overcome the inertia and fear that keep people trapped in unfulfilling patterns of behavior. The experience taught Douglas that consciousness and identity are more fluid and mysterious than he had previously understood, and that transformation often begins with imagining or documenting the person we want to become before we have the courage to actually become that person. The logbook had been both a mirror and a map, reflecting his aspirations while providing directions for achieving them through deliberate action and authentic self-expression. Story 13. The CB Radio Oracle. The voice came through Danny Rodriguez's CB radio at 3:33 a.m. on a stretch of empty highway in Nebraska, cutting through the static with crystalline clarity that made every word sound like a divine pronouncement echoing through the darkness. Danny had been monitoring Channel 19 for traffic updates and driver chatter, but the airwaves had been silent for over an hour as he traveled through the sparsely populated agricultural region where few truckers ventured during the overnight hours. Breaker 19. This is an emergency broadcast for the driver of the Blue Peterbilt eastbound at mile marker 247, the voice announced with somber authority. Danny Rodriguez, you need to hear this transmission. Your time of departure from this world is approaching rapidly. This is your notification of transition, scheduled for 6:15 a.m. this morning near the Colorado border. Please acknowledge this communication and prepare for your journey to the next dimension. Danny's hands trembled on the steering wheel as he processed the impossible content of the message. No one on the CB radio could have known his name, his truck's color and model, or his precise location on the highway. The voice spoke with the detached professionalism of a flight controller or emergency dispatcher, but the message it delivered was unlike anything that should have been transmitted over truckers' communication channels. This is Danny Rodriguez acknowledging your transmission, he replied with a voice that cracked despite his efforts to maintain composure. I don't understand what you're talking about. What kind of emergency broadcast is this? Who is this, and how do you know my name and location? The response came immediately, as if the mysterious broadcaster had been waiting for exactly that question. This is the Transition Notification Service, Danny. Every consciousness that incarnates in physical form receives advance warning before their scheduled departure from material existence. The notification typically comes through whatever communication medium is most familiar and accessible to the individual during their final hours. For truck drivers, that medium is usually the CB radio. The explanation was delivered with matter-of-fact calmness that made the supernatural content seem almost reasonable, as if death notifications were simply another form of highway information service that Danny had somehow overlooked during his 15 years of professional driving. The voice continued with specific details about the circumstances of his approaching demise, describing a collision with a deer that would occur when Danny fell asleep at the wheel due to exhaustion and caffeine withdrawal. "Your death will be instantaneous and painless," the voice assured him with clinical detachment. "The impact will occur at approximately 6:15 a.m. when your truck drifts into the median and strikes a adult male white-tailed deer that will be crossing the highway at that precise moment. The collision will cause your vehicle to overturn, resulting in fatal injuries that will cause your consciousness to separate from your physical form immediately." Danny felt a surge of terror and disbelief that made his heart race and his palms sweat despite the cool morning air flowing through his cab. The voice's prediction seemed absurdly specific and impossible to verify, yet something about its authoritative tone and detailed knowledge of his situation made it difficult to dismiss as a prank or hallucination. "This can't be real," Danny protested, his voice rising with panic. "People don't get advance notice of their deaths through CB radios. This is impossible. You're some kind of sick joker playing with people's minds. There's no such thing as a transition notification service." But even as Danny voiced his skepticism, he realized that he was indeed feeling the fatigue and caffeine withdrawal that the voice had mentioned. He had been driving for 14 hours straight, sustained only by coffee and energy drinks that were now wearing off, leaving him with the familiar combination of exhaustion and jittery nervousness that made concentration difficult and microsleep episodes increasingly likely. The voice responded to his protests with patient understanding, as if it regularly encountered resistance from people receiving death notifications. "Your skepticism is natural and expected, Danny. Most individuals refuse to accept the reality of their transition until the moment it occurs. However, this notification system exists to provide you with an opportunity to make different choices that could alter the predicted outcome. Death schedules are not absolutely fixed. They represent the most probable future based on current patterns of behavior and decision-making." This revelation transformed Danny's terror into desperate hope. If the voice was telling the truth about the possibility of changing his fate, then the supernatural warning might be a gift rather than a curse, an opportunity to prevent the tragedy that would otherwise claim his life in less than 3 hours. "What do I need to do to change what's going to happen?" Danny asked urgently. "How can I avoid this accident that you're predicting? Tell me what choices I need to make differently." The voice provides specific and practical guidance that addressed the immediate factors contributing to Danny's dangerous condition. "You must stop driving immediately and rest for at least 4 hours to counteract the fatigue that will cause you to fall asleep at the wheel. You should also consume food and water to stabilize your blood sugar and counteract the effects of excessive caffeine. Most importantly, you must call your dispatcher to report that you are taking mandatory rest time due to safety concerns." Danny pulled over at the next truck stop and followed the voice's instructions exactly, even though doing so meant missing his delivery deadline and potentially facing disciplinary action from his employer. The supernatural warning had convinced him that his life was more valuable than his job security, and he was willing to accept professional consequences in order to avoid the fatal accident that had been predicted. During his rest period, Danny researched online to see if other truckers had reported similar experiences with supernatural death notifications through CB radios. He discovered numerous accounts of drivers receiving mysterious warnings about impending accidents, health emergencies, and other life-threatening situations through their communication equipment. Many of these warnings had proven accurate when drivers ignored them, but some drivers reported successfully avoiding predicted tragedies by following the guidance they received. The phenomenon appeared to be most common among drivers who were operating under dangerous conditions due to fatigue, substance abuse, or psychological distress. The supernatural warnings seemed to emerge during situations when normal safety mechanisms had failed and drivers were approaching critical decision points that would determine their survival or demise. After resting for 6 hours, Danny resumed his journey with renewed energy and awareness. As he passed the location where his accident had been predicted to occur, he saw the deer that the voice had mentioned, standing near the roadside exactly where it would have entered his path if he had been driving according to his original schedule. The sight of the animal confirmed the accuracy of the supernatural warning and filled Danny with profound gratitude for the mysterious intervention that had saved his life. The voice never returned to Danny's CB radio, but the experience fundamentally changed his approach to safety and decision-making during his driving career. He became much more attentive to his physical and psychological condition, taking breaks whenever he felt fatigue or stress building to dangerous levels. He also began paying attention to intuitive warnings and unusual thoughts that might represent his subconscious mind's attempt to communicate important safety information. Danny shared his experience with other drivers through online forums and truck stop conversations, contributing to a growing awareness of supernatural safety phenomena in the trucking community. His story helped other drivers recognize that mysterious warnings or unusual experiences might represent legitimate guidance that could prevent accidents and save lives. The experience taught Danny that consciousness and communication exist in forms that transcend conventional understanding, and that the universe might possess mechanisms for protecting individuals who are willing to listen to guidance that comes through unconventional channels. The CB radio oracle had not only saved his life, but it also opened his awareness to spiritual dimensions of existence that enriched his understanding of purpose and meaning. Years later, Danny would describe the supernatural warning as the most important message he had ever received, a communication that had given him the opportunity to choose life over death through simple but crucial changes in his behavior and priorities. The voice from the CB radio had taught him that fate is not fixed and that conscious choice can alter even the most dire predictions when individuals are willing to accept guidance and take appropriate action. Story 14. The Invisible Passenger. The weight began manifesting in Carl Thompson's passenger seat during a solo haul from Denver to Phoenix, a familiar route that he had driven hundreds of times without ever experiencing anything more unusual than occasional wildlife sightings or unexpected weather patterns. The weight was subtle at first, just enough to trigger the truck's passenger sensor and cause the seatbelt warning chime to sound intermittently, as if someone were sitting in the seat but hadn't properly fastened their safety restraint. Carl initially assumed that a piece of his cargo had shifted and somehow affected the truck's weight distribution, causing the sensitive electronic systems to register phantom passenger presence. He pulled over at the first available truck stop to inspect his load securement and check for any obvious mechanical problems that might explain the mysterious sensor activation. The cargo was properly secured and evenly distributed, showing no signs of movement or shifting that could account for the weight anomaly. Carl tested the passenger seat manually, pressing down with his hands to see if the sensor was malfunctioning due to mechanical problems or electrical interference. The sensor responded normally to his applied pressure, but continued to indicate passenger presence even when the seat appeared completely empty. As Carl resumed his journey, the phantom weight began to feel more substantial and clearly defined, as if an actual person were sitting beside him during his drive through the desert landscape. The truck's suspension reacted to the additional weight, requiring slight adjustments to his steering and braking that became more noticeable as the phantom passenger seemed to grow heavier and more solid throughout the afternoon. Carl found himself glancing frequently at the empty passenger seat, half expecting to see someone materializing in the space that his truck's sensors insisted was occupied. The absence of any visual confirmation for the weight he was experiencing created a disorienting disconnect between his different senses, challenging his understanding of reality and making concentration increasingly difficult. During a fuel stop in Flagstaff, Carl decided to investigate the phenomenon more scientifically by placing various objects in the passenger seat to see how they affected the truck's weight sensors and handling characteristics. A 40-pound toolbox created noticeable but different effects compared to the phantom weight, which seemed to be distributed more like a human body and responded to the truck's movements in ways that suggested conscious balance adjustments. The most unsettling discovery was that the phantom weight seemed to shift position during turns and stops, as if an invisible passenger were bracing themselves against the truck's motion. Carl could feel the weight distribution changing as he navigated curves and traffic situations, creating driving dynamics that required him to compensate for passenger movement that he couldn't see or directly verify. As evening approached and the desert highway emptied of traffic, Carl began talking to his invisible passenger, partly out of loneliness and partly to test whether the phenomenon might respond to verbal interaction. To his surprise, the weight seemed to react to his conversation, shifting position as if the passenger were turning to listen more attentively or leaning forward to engage more actively in the discussion. "I don't know who you are or why you're here," Carl said aloud while navigating a particularly winding section of highway through mountainous terrain. "But if you're really in that seat, I want you to know that you're welcome to ride along as long as you don't interfere with my driving or create any safety problems. I've been making this run alone for 5 years, and I have to admit that having company, even invisible company, makes the journey feel less isolating." The phantom passenger seemed to respond positively to this welcome, settling into a more comfortable position that felt stable and collaborative rather than disruptive or threatening. Carl began to appreciate the presence as a form of companionship that eased the psychological burden of long-distance solo driving without requiring the social energy and interpersonal navigation that came with real passengers. Over the course of several hours, Carl developed a surprisingly comfortable relationship with his invisible companion. He would describe the scenery they were passing through, share observations about road conditions and traffic patterns, and even discuss personal topics such as his family relationships and career goals. The phantom weight would shift responsively during these conversations, creating the impression of an engaged and empathetic listener. Carl discovered that the invisible passenger presence seemed to enhance his driving performance rather than detracting from it. The need to compensate for passenger weight distribution forced him to drive more smoothly and deliberately, while the sense of companionship reduced the fatigue and inattention that often affected solo drivers during long hauls. The phantom passenger also seemed to provide an early warning system for potential hazards, shifting position or increasing apparent alertness before Carl himself noticed approaching obstacles or dangerous road conditions. This supernatural co-pilot effect helped Carl avoid several potential accidents and navigate challenging driving situations with enhanced awareness and reflexes. As Carl's delivery route neared completion and he approached the Phoenix metropolitan area, he began to feel melancholy about the prospect of losing his invisible companion. The phantom passenger had transformed what would normally have been a lonely and routine journey into an experience of shared adventure and mutual support that had exceeded his expectations for supernatural encounters. "I want to thank you for riding with me," Carl said as he prepared to make his final delivery. "I don't know who you are or where you come from, but you've been the best traveling companion I've had in years. You've helped me drive safer, feel less alone, and remember what it's like to share experiences with someone who cares about the journey as much as the destination." The phantom weight gradually decreased as Carl completed his delivery and began preparing for his return journey, eventually disappearing entirely as he left the Phoenix area and headed back toward Denver. The passenger seat sensor returned to normal operation, and the truck's handling characteristics reverted to their standard solo configuration. Carl never experienced the phantom passenger phenomenon again, but the memory of that shared journey remained one of his most cherished professional experiences. The invisible companion had taught him valuable lessons about the importance of mental engagement and emotional connection during long-distance driving, encouraging him to maintain awareness and appreciation for his travels, rather than simply enduring them as necessary hardships. The experience also led Carl to become more open to providing rides to actual passengers, when company policies and safety considerations permitted, recognizing that shared experiences could enhance rather than complicate his professional activities. The phantom passenger had shown him the value of companionship and collaboration that could be achieved even under the most unusual circumstances. Years later, Carl would describe his invisible passenger as an angel or guardian spirit that had appeared during a period when he needed guidance and support, but was too isolated or proud to ask for help from living people. The supernatural companion had provided exactly the kind of presence and assistance that he required to navigate both the physical challenges of his route and the emotional challenges of his increasingly solitary lifestyle. Story 15. Messages in the Frost. The words appeared on Mitchell Kane's windshield during a frigid January morning in Montana, spelled out in delicate frost patterns that formed while his truck was parked at a remote rest area where temperatures had dropped to 20 degrees below zero overnight. Mitchell discovered the crystalline message when he emerged from his sleeper cabin to begin his pre-trip inspection, finding his name written in elegant script across the glass surface where his defroster would normally have created uniform melting patterns. Mitchell Kane. The frost spelled in flowing letters that seemed too precise and deliberate to be the result of random ice crystal formation. The message was positioned at exact eye level, as if someone had carefully calculated the optimal placement for maximum visibility and impact. Mitchell stood transfixed by the impossibility of what he was observing, knowing that frost patterns were determined by temperature differentials and moisture content, rather than by conscious intelligence or deliberate communication. Mitchell examined the windshield carefully, looking for signs that someone might have traced the letters with their finger, or used some other method to create the message artificially. But the frost formation appeared completely natural, composed of the same delicate ice crystals that covered every other surface of his truck. The letters were formed by variations in crystal density and orientation that created readable text without any obvious mechanical intervention. As Mitchell started his engine and activated the windshield defroster, the frost message began to dissolve in a specific pattern that revealed additional words underneath the initial layer. Remember Sarah appeared as the first letters melted away, followed by she needs you to forgive, and finally call her today. As the last of the frost disappeared and normal visibility was restored to the windshield. The name Sarah and the message about forgiveness struck Mitchell with profound emotional impact, as they referred to his estranged daughter who had cut off contact with him 3 years earlier following a bitter argument about her choice of career and lifestyle. Mitchell had been too proud and stubborn to make the first move toward reconciliation, while Sarah had apparently been waiting for an acknowledgement of wrongdoing that Mitchell had been unwilling to provide. Mitchell sat in his truck for several minutes processing the implications of receiving such a personal and specific message through windshield frost formation. The supernatural communication had addressed the most painful and unresolved relationship in his life, providing guidance that he desperately needed but had been unable to generate through his own emotional resources and decision-making processes. Over the following days, frost messages continued to appear on Mitchell's windshield whenever he parked overnight in cold weather conditions. The messages varied in content and complexity, sometimes offering practical advice about route selection or mechanical maintenance, other times providing spiritual guidance about personal growth and relationship healing. Take the Highway 287 through Wyoming. One message advised during a particularly challenging delivery schedule: construction delays on I-80 will cost you 6 hours. Mitchell followed this guidance and discovered that the alternate route indeed avoided major traffic problems that would have significantly delayed his delivery and potentially resulted in customer complaints or scheduling conflicts. Another frost message provided information about a developing mechanical problem that hadn't yet become apparent through normal inspection procedures. Check your air brake lines before driving today, the crystalline letters warned. Leak developing near rear axle could cause failure. Mitchell's inspection revealed the beginning of a leak that could have resulted in brake failure if left unaddressed, potentially causing a serious accident. The most meaningful Frost messages continue to focus on Mitchell's relationship with his daughter, providing specific suggestions for rebuilding their connection and healing the emotional wounds that had driven them apart. Sarah graduated last month, one message informed him. Send flowers with a note saying you're proud of her accomplishments. When Mitchell followed this advice, he received his first communication from Sarah in 3 years. A brief but warm thank you message that opened the door for further conversation. Mitchell began documenting the Frost messages by taking photographs before starting his engine, creating a record of the supernatural guidance he was receiving. The messages were consistently accurate and helpful, providing information and advice that improved both his professional performance and personal relationships in ways that exceeded what Mitchell could have achieved through conventional means. The phenomenon seemed to be most active during periods when Mitchell was facing important decisions or emotional challenges that required wisdom and courage beyond his normal capabilities. The Frost messages served as a form of spiritual counseling that addressed his deepest needs while respecting his independence and free will to choose whether or not to follow the guidance provided. As Mitchell's relationship with Sarah gradually healed through phone calls, letters, and eventually face-to-face meetings, the Frost messages became less frequent and more celebratory in tone. She Loves You appeared one morning after a particularly meaningful conversation with his daughter. Trust Is Growing followed several weeks later after Sarah had invited Mitchell to visit her new home and meet her boyfriend. The final Frost message appeared on the morning when Mitchell was preparing to drive to Sarah's wedding, an event that represented the complete restoration of their relationship and his acceptance back into her life as a loving and supportive father. Today you become whole again, the crystal spelled across his windshield. Joy and forgiveness have healed what anger and pride had broken. Mitchell never received another Frost message after his daughter's wedding, but the experience had fundamentally transformed his understanding of communication, guidance, and the possibility that consciousness might exist in forms that transcended normal human experience. The crystalline letters had been more than supernatural curiosity. They had been instruments of healing that had guided him toward the most important reconciliation of his life. The experience taught Mitchell that wisdom and guidance often come through unexpected channels, and that remaining open to unusual forms of communication can lead to breakthroughs that conventional approaches cannot achieve. The Frost messages had provided exactly the kind of spiritual counseling and practical advice that he needed to overcome his own emotional limitations and rebuild the relationship that mattered most to him. Years later, Mitchell would describe the Frost messages as divine intervention that had used the natural world to deliver supernatural guidance during the most crucial period of his emotional and spiritual development. The windshield had become a tablet for heavenly communication that had saved his relationship with his daughter and taught him invaluable lessons about forgiveness, humility, and the enduring power of parental love. Story 16. The Bleeding Dashboard. The first drop of blood appeared on Harold Whitman's dashboard during a routine inspection stop in Nevada. A single crimson bead that seemed to materialize from nowhere on the black plastic surface near his GPS display. Harold initially assumed that he had somehow injured himself during his pre-trip inspection and failed to notice the minor cut that was producing the blood, but a careful examination of his hands, arms, and face revealed no wounds or abrasions that could account for the mysterious bleeding. Harold wiped away the blood drop with a paper towel and continued his inspection, but within minutes another drop appeared in a slightly different location on the dashboard, followed by another, and then several more, in a pattern that suggested active bleeding from a source that existed somewhere within or above the dashboard structure itself. The blood appeared to be completely normal in color, consistency, and behavior, flowing and coagulating exactly as human blood would under similar temperature and humidity conditions. Harold collected a sample in a small container, thinking that laboratory analysis might provide clues about the source and nature of the mysterious bleeding, but the specimen disappeared overnight, leaving behind only a faint reddish stain that gradually faded to invisibility. As Harold resumed his journey westward, the dashboard bleeding became more frequent and voluminous, creating rivulets that ran down the curved surface and dripped onto his logbook, floor mats, and personal belongings. The blood seemed to emerge from invisible sources throughout the dashboard area, appearing spontaneously without any visible wounds or openings that could explain its origin. Harold contacted his dispatcher to report the unusual mechanical problem, but the company's maintenance department had no record of any issues involving mysterious bleeding from truck dashboards. The dispatcher suggested that Harold might be experiencing stress hallucinations and recommended that he seek medical evaluation at the next available clinic or hospital. But the blood was undeniably real, creating stains and odors that couldn't be explained as psychological phenomena or sensory hallucinations. Harold began covering his dashboard with plastic sheeting and towels to protect his equipment and documents from the continuous bleeding, creating a makeshift barrier that became soaked with blood within hours of being installed. The emotional impact of driving a truck that appeared to be bleeding from multiple invisible wounds was profoundly disturbing to Harold's psychological well-being. The constant presence of blood created an atmosphere of injury and mortality that made concentration difficult and transformed his familiar cab into a space that felt haunted by violence and suffering. Harold began researching the history of his truck, wondering if some past tragedy might explain the supernatural bleeding that was occurring in his dashboard. Company records revealed that the truck had previously been driven by a man named Frank Morrison, who had died of a heart attack while parked at a truck stop in Colorado 2 years earlier. Frank had been discovered slumped over his steering wheel, and the official cause of death was cardiac arrest brought on by years of poor diet, stress, and lack of exercise. But according to informal accounts from other drivers who had known Frank, his final hours had been marked by complaints of severe headaches and nosebleeds that his fellow truckers had attributed to high blood pressure or altitude sickness. Frank had apparently been bleeding from his nose and mouth during the hours before his death, creating stains on his dashboard and seat that had been cleaned by company personnel before the truck was reassigned to Harold. This discovery suggested that the mysterious bleeding might be a supernatural echo of Frank's final medical crisis, a spiritual residue left behind by the trauma and suffering that had occurred in the truck's cab during its previous driver's death. The blood that Harold was observing might be a manifestation of Frank's spirit, still experiencing the physical distress that had preceded his cardiac arrest. Harold began speaking aloud to Frank's spirit, acknowledging his presence and expressing sympathy for the suffering he had endured during his final hours. "Frank, I know you died in this truck, and I'm sorry that your last moments were painful and frightening. But you don't need to keep bleeding here. You're not in that body anymore, and you don't have to relive that medical emergency over and over again." The bleeding seemed to respond to Harold's compassionate acknowledgement, decreasing in frequency and intensity as he continued to address Frank's spirit with respect and understanding. Harold began sharing stories about his own experiences with the truck, describing the routes he was traveling and the cargo he was hauling, as if including Frank in his ongoing professional activities. "We're carrying auto parts to California today, Frank," Harold would say during his daily communications with the spirit. "The weather's been good, and traffic hasn't been too heavy. I think you would have enjoyed this run, especially the stretch through the mountains where the scenery is so beautiful. I hope you can still appreciate these roads from wherever you are now." These conversations seemed to bring comfort to both Harold and Frank's spirit, transforming the bleeding dashboard from a source of horror into a medium for spiritual communication and mutual support. The blood drops became less frequent and eventually took on a more peaceful quality, appearing occasionally as if Frank were simply letting Harold know that he was still present and grateful for the companionship. Harold developed a ritual of placing a small flower or meaningful object on the dashboard each morning as a memorial gesture for Frank, acknowledging his continued presence while encouraging him to find peace and move on to whatever spiritual destination awaited him. These offerings seemed to be appreciated, as the bleeding would typically stop for several hours after each memorial placement. The final bleeding episode occurred as Harold was completing what would have been Frank's favorite route through the Rocky Mountains, a challenging but scenic drive that Frank had apparently requested frequently during his years with the company. As Harold reached the highest point of the mountain pass, a single drop of blood appeared on the dashboard, followed by what seemed like a sigh of contentment, or relief that Harold felt rather than heard. After that moment, the bleeding stopped completely and never returned, suggesting that Frank's spirit had finally found the peace and release that had been eluding him since his traumatic death. Harold continued driving the truck for several more years without experiencing any supernatural phenomena, but he maintained his daily practice of acknowledging Frank's memory and expressing gratitude for the spiritual companionship that had transformed a frightening experience into an opportunity for healing and connection. The bleeding dashboard taught Harold valuable lessons about the persistence of consciousness after death and the importance of compassionate acknowledgement for spirits who remain attached to physical locations due to unresolved trauma or incomplete emotional business. Frank's spirit had needed recognition and companionship to complete his transition from physical to spiritual existence, and Harold's willingness to provide that support had benefited both of them in profound and lasting ways. Years later, Harold would describe his experience with Frank's bleeding spirit as one of the most meaningful relationships of his trucking career, a supernatural mentorship that had taught him about courage, compassion, and the enduring bonds that can exist between people who share common experiences and mutual respect. The blood that had initially terrified him had ultimately become a bridge between worlds, facilitating communication and healing that transcended the boundaries of life and death. Story 17. The Repeating Numbers. The license plate phenomenon began for Antonio Vasquez on a Tuesday morning in Texas, when he noticed that every vehicle he passed, or that passed him, displayed license plates containing the numbers 827 in various combinations and arrangements. At first, Antonio attributed the pattern to selective attention, assuming that his brain was simply noticing a common number sequence that had always been present but had previously escaped his conscious awareness. But as the day progressed, and Antonio continued his journey toward Louisiana, the prevalence of 827 license plates became impossible to explain as coincidence or perceptual bias. Cars, trucks, motorcycles, and even trailers displayed the numbers in different orders. 827, JKO, BCD, 827, 8279-X, and dozens of other variations that created a highway full of numerical messages that seemed designed specifically for Antonio's attention. Antonio began documenting the license plates by writing down their complete alphanumeric sequences, creating a log that quickly filled several pages of his notebook. The pattern was consistent and overwhelming, with 827 appearing on approximately 70% of all license plates he encountered during his drive through 3 different states. The statistical impossibility of such a concentration of specific numbers forced Antonio to consider that he might be experiencing a supernatural phenomenon rather than a remarkable coincidence. The number 827 held special significance in Antonio's personal history, as it was the address of the house where he had grown up in a small town in Mexico before immigrating to the United States with his family 25 years earlier. The house at 827 Calle Flores had been the site of his childhood memories, family celebrations, and the farewell gathering before his family's departure for their new life in America. Antonio had been planning to visit his childhood home during his upcoming vacation, but financial pressures and work obligations had forced him to postpone the trip repeatedly over the past several years. The appearance of his childhood address on hundreds of license plates seemed like a cosmic reminder of his unfulfilled promise to return to his roots and reconnect with the community and culture that had shaped his early life. As Antonio continued documenting the license plate phenomenon, he began to notice additional patterns that strengthened the connection to his personal history and family heritage. Some plates contained combinations of 827 with other numbers that corresponded to significant dates in his family's history: birth dates, wedding anniversaries, and the date of their immigration to the United States. One particularly striking license plate read 8271998, which was the exact year that Antonio's father had died of diabetes complications, leaving behind a family that struggled to maintain their cultural connections while adapting to life in their adopted country. Another plate displayed 827 Yoho, using the Spanish word for son to create a message that felt personally directed at Antonio's identity as his father's eldest son and the current head of his extended family. The emotional impact of seeing his personal history reflected in the license plates of random vehicles created a profound sense of spiritual communication that transcended rational explanation. Antonio began to feel that his deceased father was somehow using the highway environment to send messages about the importance of honoring family traditions and maintaining connections to cultural heritage. During a fuel stop in Louisiana, Antonio called his mother to describe the license plate phenomenon and asked for her interpretation of its possible meaning. She listened with interest and understanding, sharing her own belief that the spirits of deceased family members often found creative ways to communicate with living relatives who needed guidance or encouragement. "Your father always worried that we would lose our Mexican identity in America," she explained during their conversation. "He wanted you children to remember where you came from and to visit the family that we left behind. Maybe he's reminding you that some promises are more important than money or work schedules." This conversation convinced Antonio to prioritize his planned trip to Mexico, using his accumulated vacation time and savings to visit his childhood home and reconnect with relatives who had remained in his hometown. The decision felt spiritually guided and emotionally necessary, as if his father's spirit was using the license plate messages to ensure that important family connections wouldn't be lost to the pressures of modern American life. As Antonio modified his route to head toward the Mexican border instead of continuing his original delivery schedule, the frequency of 827 license plates began to decrease, eventually returning to statistically normal levels as he approached his hometown. The phenomenon seemed to have achieved its purpose of redirecting Antonio's priorities toward family and cultural heritage rather than purely economic considerations. The visit to his childhood home proved to be profoundly meaningful and healing for Antonio's sense of identity and family connection. He spent time with elderly relatives who remembered his father with love and respect, sharing stories and memories that enriched Antonio's understanding of his heritage and family history. The trip also allowed him to fulfill promises he had made to his father before his death, including visiting his grave and ensuring that family traditions would be maintained for future generations. During his stay in Mexico, Antonio visited the house at 827 Calle Flores, which was now occupied by a different family but remained largely unchanged from his childhood memories. Standing in front of the address that had appeared on so many license plates, Antonio felt a profound sense of completion and spiritual communication with his father's spirit. The license plate phenomenon never recurred after Antonio's trip to Mexico, suggesting that the supernatural guidance had achieved its intended purpose of reconnecting him with his roots and fulfilling his obligations to family and cultural heritage. Antonio returned to his trucking career with a renewed sense of identity and purpose that improved his overall satisfaction and emotional well-being. The experience taught Antonio valuable lessons about the importance of balancing economic necessity with spiritual and emotional needs, and about the creative ways that deceased loved ones might communicate guidance to help living family members make important life decisions. The repeated numbers had served as a form of spiritual GPS, redirecting his life's journey toward destinations that mattered more than financial gain or professional advancement. Years later, Antonio would describe the 827 license plate phenomenon as his father's final gift to him, a supernatural intervention that had prevented him from losing touch with the cultural and family connections that gave his life deeper meaning and purpose. The highway had become a medium for spiritual communication that transcended the boundaries between life and death, delivering messages of love and guidance that improved every aspect of Antonio's personal and professional existence. Story 18, The Otherworld Window. The passenger side window of Elena Rodriguez's truck began displaying an alternate reality on a foggy Thursday morning in Oregon, showing landscapes and activities that bore no resemblance to the actual highway environment through which she was traveling. Elena first noticed the phenomenon while navigating a winding mountain road through dense forest when she glanced to her right and saw what appeared to be a bustling city street filled with pedestrians, shops, and vehicles that existed nowhere in the remote wilderness area where she was actually driving. The alternate world visible through her passenger window was vivid and detailed, displaying a level of visual complexity that seemed impossible to achieve through hallucination or optical illusion. Elena could see individual people walking along sidewalks, reading newspapers, entering and exiting buildings, and conducting the daily activities of urban life in a metropolitan environment that was completely inconsistent with her actual location. Elena pulled over at the next available turnout to investigate the phenomena more carefully, examining her truck's windows for signs of damage, film, or electronic displays that might explain the impossible imagery she was observing. The passenger window appeared completely normal from the exterior, showing accurate reflections of the surrounding forest landscape. But from inside the cab, the window continued to display the alternate urban reality with consistent detail and movement. The two worlds seemed to exist simultaneously in the same space, with Elena's actual environment visible through her driver's side window and windshield, while the passenger window revealed an entirely different dimension of existence. The contrast between the rural mountain setting and the urban cityscape created a disorienting dual reality that challenged Elena's understanding of perception, space, and the nature of parallel universes. As Elena resumed her journey down the mountain highway, the alternate world visible through her passenger window began to change and evolve, displaying different locations and time periods that seemed to follow their own logic and geography. She saw desert landscapes with ancient ruins, tropical beaches with crystal clear water, snow-covered plains with herds of wild animals, and futuristic cities with architecture that defied conventional engineering principles. The alternate reality window seemed to respond to Elena's emotional state and mental focus, displaying environments that reflected her current mood or addressed her psychological needs. During stressful periods of heavy traffic or challenging road conditions, the window would show peaceful, natural settings that provided visual relief and emotional comfort. When Elena felt lonely or isolated, the window would display scenes of human community and social connection that eased her sense of separation. Elena began to experiment with the phenomenon by consciously focusing on specific desires or interests to see if the alternate world would respond to her mental direction. When she thought about her childhood home in California, the window began displaying scenes from her hometown, showing familiar streets, buildings, and even people who resembled her family members and childhood friends. The most remarkable discovery was that the alternate world seemed to exist in real time, with weather patterns, lighting conditions, and daily activities that followed logical progressions and natural rhythms. Elena could watch sunrise and sunset in the alternate reality, observe seasonal changes over the course of weeks, and follow the ongoing lives of people who appeared regularly in the window's display. One particularly fascinating aspect of the phenomenon was the occasional appearance of alternate versions of Elena herself, living different lives and making different choices in the parallel reality. She would see herself working as a teacher in a small town, running a restaurant in a coastal city, or traveling the world as a photographer. These alternate selves appeared happy and fulfilled, living lives that represented paths not taken in Elena's actual existence. The alternate reality window became a source of inspiration and comfort during Elena's long-haul journeys, providing mental stimulation and emotional support that exceeded what she could achieve through conventional entertainment or communication methods. The constantly changing scenery and activities offered unlimited variety and interest, making even the most routine drives feel like adventures through multiple dimensions. Elena began documenting the alternate world through detailed written descriptions and sketches, creating a journal that recorded the various locations, people, and events she observed through her passenger window. The journal became a creative outlet that enhanced her appreciation for the phenomenon while providing a record of experiences that no one else could share or verify. The emotional impact of regularly observing alternate versions of her life and world created both inspiration and melancholy for Elena, as she was reminded of the infinite possibilities that existed beyond her current circumstances. The window showed her that reality was far more flexible and varied than she had previously understood, but it also highlighted the limitations and choices that defined her actual existence. During a particularly difficult period when Elena was considering leaving the trucking profession due to burnout and dissatisfaction, the alternate reality window began displaying scenes of her future self successfully transitioning to new careers and lifestyles. She saw herself teaching driving skills to new truckers, starting her own transportation business, and eventually retiring to a small farm where she raised animals and grew vegetables. These glimpses of possible futures provided Elena with hope and direction during her career crisis, showing her that change was possible and that her current dissatisfaction was temporary rather than permanent. The alternate reality window had become a counseling tool that helped her envision positive outcomes and make decisions that aligned with her deeper values and aspirations. As Elena implemented changes in her career and personal life based on insights gained from the alternate reality window, the phenomenon began to occur less frequently and with less dramatic contrast to her actual environment. The window gradually returned to normal function, as if the alternate world had served its purpose of providing guidance and inspiration during a crucial period of Elena's life development. Elena never experienced the alternate reality window again after she successfully transitioned to a new career as a driving instructor and small business owner. But the memory of those parallel world glimpses continued to influence her perspective on possibility, choice, and the multidimensional nature of existence. The window had shown her that life contained infinite potential for change and growth, encouraging her to remain open to new experiences and opportunities. The phenomenon taught Elena valuable lessons about perception, reality, and the importance of maintaining vision for alternative futures even when current circumstances seemed fixed or limiting. The alternate world window had been both entertainment and education, providing her with expanded awareness of possibility that improved her decision-making and life satisfaction for years to come. Story 19. The Endless Gauge. The fuel gauge in Patricia Campbell's truck began its supernatural spin on a Wednesday evening near the Colorado-Utah border, where the needles started rotating continuously clockwise, regardless of the actual fuel level in her tanks. Patricia initially assumed that the gauge was malfunctioning due to electrical problems or sensor failure, a common enough occurrence in older trucks that typically required nothing more than professional repair or replacement of faulty component. But when Patricia checked her actual fuel levels using the tank-mounted sight gauges and manual dipstick measurements, she discovered that her fuel supply was exactly where it should be based on her recent fill-up and current mileage. The spinning gauge was displaying impossible readings, while her actual fuel consumption remained completely normal, creating a disconnect between instrument readings and mechanical reality that defied rational explanation. The needle's rotation followed a hypnotic pattern that seemed designed to capture attention and induce a trance-like state in anyone who watched it for extended periods. Patricia found herself becoming mesmerized by the gauge's endless motion, losing track of time and road conditions as she became absorbed in trying to understand the significance of the perpetual spinning that had replaced normal fuel level indication. As the spinning continued through the night and into the following day, Patricia began to notice that the gauge's rotation speed would vary in response to different factors that had nothing to do with fuel consumption or mechanical operation. The needle would spin faster during periods of stress or anxiety, slow down during moments of calm or contentment, and occasionally reverse direction when Patricia experienced strong emotional responses to events or memories. The gauge seemed to be measuring something other than fuel, perhaps registering Patricia's psychological energy, spiritual vitality, or life force in ways that conventional instruments were never designed to detect. The spinning needle had become a barometer for her internal state, rather than her external fuel supply, providing a continuous readout of psychological and emotional information that was both fascinating and unsettling. Patricia began experimenting with the phenomenon by deliberately changing her mental and emotional state to see how the gauge would respond to different psychological conditions. Positive thoughts and feelings would cause the needle to spin smoothly and steadily, while negative emotions or stressful situations would create erratic, jerky movements that reflected her internal turbulence. The most dramatic gauge responses occurred when Patricia thought about significant people and events from her past, particularly her relationship with her teenage son who had been killed in a car accident 3 years earlier. Memories of her son would cause the needle to spin rapidly in a specific pattern that felt like communication rather than random mechanical movement, as if the gauge was somehow channeling his presence or attempting to deliver messages from beyond. During one particularly intense episode, the gauge needle stopped spinning entirely and pointed to a position that didn't correspond to any marking on the fuel level display. The needle remained motionless for several minutes, while Patricia experienced vivid memories of her last conversation with her son, a discussion about his plans for college and his dreams of becoming an engineer. The gauge seemed to be creating a moment of spiritual connection that transcended normal time and space limitations. When the spinning resumed, it followed a rhythm that reminded Patricia of her son's heartbeat, a steady pulse that she had felt countless times when he was young, and would fall asleep against her chest during bedtime stories. The gauge had become a medium for continued connection with her deceased child, providing comfort and reassurance that his presence remained accessible despite his physical absence. Patricia began talking to her son through the gauge, sharing details about her daily experiences and asking for guidance about important decisions she was facing in her personal and professional life. The gauge would respond with specific spinning patterns that Patricia learned to interpret as answers or acknowledgments, creating a supernatural communication system that helped her process grief and maintain emotional connection with her lost child. The spinning gauge also began providing practical information about road conditions, weather patterns, and potential hazards that Patricia wouldn't normally encounter until later in her journey. The needle would accelerate or change direction to warn her about upcoming construction zones, accident scenes, or dangerous weather conditions, allowing her to adjust her route or driving strategy before problems became apparent through conventional means. Other truckers who observed Patricia's spinning fuel gauge were initially skeptical about her claims regarding its supernatural properties, but several drivers reported that their own instrument readings became more accurate and reliable after spending time in Patricia's truck or following her through challenging driving conditions. The gauge seemed to broadcast protective energy that benefited other drivers who remained open to its influence. Patricia's delivery schedules became remarkably efficient and problem-free as she learned to trust the gauge's guidance about route selection, timing, and vehicle maintenance needs. The spinning needle would indicate when mechanical problems were developing before they became serious enough to cause breakdowns or safety hazards, allowing Patricia to address issues proactively rather than reactively. The emotional healing that Patricia experienced through her communication with her son's spirit via the spinning gauge was profound and life-changing. The ongoing connection helped her process grief in healthy ways while maintaining hope and purpose despite her devastating loss. The gauge had transformed her truck cab into a sacred space where love transcended death and communication continued beyond physical separation. As Patricia's grief gradually transformed from raw pain into peaceful acceptance, the gauge's spinning began to slow and stabilize, eventually returning to normal fuel level indication. After several months of supernatural operation, the phenomenon seemed to have served its purpose of facilitating healing and spiritual communication during the most difficult period of Patricia's bereavement process. Patricia continued driving the same truck for many years after the gauge returned to normal function, but she never forgot the spiritual connection and guidance that the spinning needle had provided during her darkest hours. She placed a small photograph of her son near the fuel gauge as a permanent memorial, acknowledging the role that the supernatural instrument had played in her healing and recovery. The experience taught Patricia that consciousness and love are not limited by physical death, and that spiritual communication can occur through any medium when the conditions are right and the need is genuine. The spinning gauge had been a bridge between worlds that allowed her to maintain relationship with her son, while gradually accepting the reality of his physical absence and rebuilding her capacity for joy and hope. Story 20. Voices from the Empty Sleeper. The conversations began for Raymond Torres during a solo cross-country haul from Seattle to Miami, emanating from his truck's empty sleeper cabin with the clarity and authenticity of real human dialogue between multiple participants. Raymond would hear distinct voices discussing topics ranging from philosophy and current events to personal experiences and emotional relationships, all taking place in the confined space behind his driver's seat, where no passengers or electronic devices could account for the ongoing discussions. The voices belonged to different individuals with distinct personalities, speaking patterns, and areas of expertise that created the impression of a diverse group of travelers sharing space and conversation during the long journey across America. There was an elderly woman who spoke with the wisdom of someone who had experienced many decades of life's challenges and triumphs, a middle-aged man whose conversations revealed extensive knowledge of history and literature, and a younger person whose observations reflected contemporary cultural awareness and technological savvy. Raymond initially assumed that he was receiving radio transmissions from other vehicles or electronic interference from nearby communication systems, but careful inspection of his truck's audio equipment revealed that all devices were functioning normally, and none were receiving the mysterious conversations that filled his sleeper cabin with phantom social interaction. The voices seemed to be aware of Raymond's presence and would occasionally direct comments and questions toward him, creating opportunities for him to participate in discussions that were far more intellectually stimulating and emotionally satisfying than the solitary experience that characterized most of his long-haul journeys. The invisible passengers treated Raymond as a valued member of their travel group, seeking his opinions and sharing their knowledge in ways that made him feel genuinely included and appreciated. The elderly woman, whom the others called Margaret, often shared stories about her experiences during historical events that Raymond had only read about in books or seen depicted in movies. She described living through the Great Depression, World War II, the Civil Rights Movement, and other significant periods with personal detail that brought historical events to life in ways that academic sources could never achieve. Her perspectives on social change and human resilience provided Raymond with insights that enhanced his understanding of American culture and history. The scholarly man, who identified himself as Professor Williams, engaged Raymond in philosophical discussions about the meaning of travel, the nature of consciousness, and the relationship between individual experience and universal truth. These conversations challenged Raymond to think more deeply about his own life choices and values, encouraging intellectual growth that made his driving time feel productive and enriching rather than merely endurable. The young person in the group, whose voice suggested someone in their 20s or 30s, helped Raymond understand contemporary technology, social media trends, and cultural developments that he had been too busy or isolated to follow closely. This generational perspective helped Raymond feel more connected to modern society and better equipped to relate to younger people in his personal and professional relationships. The conversations among the invisible passengers continued throughout Raymond's journey, providing constant companionship and mental stimulation that transformed what would normally have been a lonely cross-country drive into an educational and social experience. The voices would discuss the landscapes they were passing through, comment on regional differences in culture and customs, and share observations about the communities and lifestyles they encountered along their route. Raymond began to look forward to these conversations more than any other aspect of his driving experience, often extending his driving hours to spend more time listening to and participating in the discussions that filled his sleeper cabin with warmth and intellectual energy. The invisible passengers had become his most valued companions, providing friendship and wisdom that exceeded what he received from most of his real-world relationships. The voices demonstrated extensive knowledge about Raymond's personal history and current circumstances, offering advice and support that addressed his specific needs and challenges with remarkable accuracy and sensitivity. They helped him work through problems with his family relationships, provided guidance about financial decisions, and offered encouragement during periods of professional difficulty or personal doubt. Margaret frequently shared wisdom about dealing with loneliness and isolation, drawing from her own experiences as a widow who had learned to find meaning and connection despite physical separation from loved ones. Her advice helped Raymond develop strategies for maintaining emotional health during extended periods away from home and family, teaching him that solitude could be productive and enriching rather than merely endured. Professor Williams engaged Raymond in discussions about the philosophical implications of modern transportation and communication technology, helping him understand his role as a trucker in the broader context of human civilization and economic development. These conversations gave Raymond a greater sense of purpose and dignity in his profession, encouraging him to see his work as essential to social functioning rather than merely a way to earn money. The younger voice provided Raymond with practical advice about using technology to stay connected with family and friends, introducing him to communication tools and social platforms that helped him maintain relationships despite his nomadic lifestyle. This guidance significantly improved Raymond's ability to participate in his family's daily life and maintain emotional connections that had been deteriorating due to physical absence. As Raymond's cross-country journey neared completion and he approached his destination in Miami, the conversations from his sleeper cabin began to focus on themes of transition, completion, and new beginnings. The invisible passengers expressed gratitude for the journey they had shared and offered final words of wisdom and encouragement for Raymond's future travels and life experiences. Margaret reminded Raymond that every journey changes the traveler in ways that can't be fully understood until much later, encouraging him to remain open to the lessons and growth opportunities that his traveling lifestyle provided. Professor Williams emphasized the importance of continuing to learn and grow intellectually regardless of age or circumstances. The younger voice encouraged Raymond to maintain his newly developed connections and communication skills. The voices gradually faded as Raymond completed his delivery and prepared for his return journey, eventually disappearing entirely as he left the Miami area. The silence that filled his sleeper cabin felt profound and meaningful rather than empty, as if the invisible passengers had completed their mission of providing companionship and guidance during a crucial period of Raymond's personal development. Raymond never heard the voices again during subsequent trips, but the conversations had fundamentally changed his approach to solitary travel and personal growth. He had learned that loneliness was a choice rather than an inevitable consequence of physical isolation, and that intellectual and emotional enrichment could be found in unexpected places when one remained open to unusual forms of connection and communication. The experience taught Raymond that consciousness and companionship exist in forms that transcend physical presence, and that the most meaningful relationships can sometimes develop with beings whose existence can't be verified through conventional means. The voices from his empty sleeper cabin had provided exactly the kind of friendship and guidance that he needed during a transitional period in his life, helping him develop skills and perspectives that improved every aspect of his personal and professional existence. Years later, Raymond would describe his encounter with the invisible passengers as the most educational and emotionally satisfying journey of his trucking career, an experience that had taught him invaluable lessons about learning, growth, and the importance of remaining open to wisdom and companionship, regardless of their source or nature. The empty sleeper cabin had been filled with more genuine human connection than many spaces occupied by physical people, demonstrating that meaningful relationships can develop anywhere that kindness, curiosity, and authentic communication are welcomed and nurtured.